Welcome everybody to the Lake Bluff School District 65 Board of Education Committee of the Whole meeting for June 11th, 2013. Christine, could you take a roll call, please?
Mark Berry.
Present.
Jean Morozen.
John, present.
John, I'm sorry. You get used to this. Chris Letchinger, present. Leanne Charlo.
Present.
Julie Gottschall.
Present.
Richard Heck.
Present.
Susan Ryder.
Present.
Everybody's present. We have a quorum. We are going to start with the opportunity for public comment. If anybody would like to address the board, we welcome comments from staff, parents, and constituents. The board president will determine the format and ground rules for comments in the best interest of the audience and the agenda. So if anybody would like to say anything, please step forward. If not, we will move right into item number 4 on our agenda, which is our presentation. Orientation to school district finance on budgets, bonds, and projections, starting with Jane Lair. Hi, Jane.
Good evening. First of all, I want to point out to you the notebooks in front of you. Those are not for this evening's discussion. Those are a gift from me. It's just got a lot of financial information, historical information, salary information, EAV history, etc. Hopefully, it's just a resource for you at any time you need it. I gave this to the new board members a couple of years ago, and I failed to keep them updated, but I resolved to keep these updated for you from here on out. First thing that will be updated will be the 13-14 budget, because those notebooks you have the 12-13 budget. So as we adopt the new budget and finalize salaries and things like that, I'll provide you with information so you can replace what's in those notebooks. But anyway, hope those are helpful, and at any time you have questions about anything in there, just contact me. Dr. Sophie, yes?
Can you share when the assessment for this will be, please?
Pardon?
The test, the assessment?
Tomorrow, 20 question, true, false.
It'll be a pop quiz at any given time. So, all right, with that, this evening, I'm going to start with just a brief overview of the preliminary budget for 13-14. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because I think we want to get to the bond discussion. However, anytime you have questions, don't hesitate. Tonight's meeting, really, we want it to be informal. Herb's going to come down here. It's going to be an informal meeting. We want everybody just to speak up, ask questions. It's a dialogue. It's an educational meeting for all of us it's the first budget adoption that this board will have as a new board. And then when we get to the bond discussion, it truly is just educating us all on our current debt structure, what options we have in the future to realign that debt, if any. So this is just a give and take. So please treat this as a very informal, roll up your sleeves meeting. With that, yes. Okay. Literally, Mark. All right, with that, we'll start on next year's preliminary budget. I'm not going to read these to you because I know you can all read and you've had them for a few days, but I've included in here the assumptions and the highlights of the new budget. The budget summary that you have in this document is not final, and it is a dynamic document. However, it's not going to vary very much by the time you adopt the final budget or the tentative budget in August. So there will be some changes, but nothing significant. So what you have here is a really good picture for next year's budget. Salaries, we know for the most part. We make some assumptions on those line items, such as substitutes and things like that we don't know, but we know history and we know trends, so we budget accordingly. And we also have to make assumptions for teachers who have horizontal movement. And for those of you who don't understand what that means, is when a teacher receives enough postgraduate credit that they move a lane in the salary schedule. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so we don't get a lot of that information until sometimes in September. They have to give us that information by October 1st. So we make assumptions based on history about what those changes will be in salary.
That doesn't involve that many teachers, though, really. Or does
I
it?
can't tell you teachers, I can tell you dollars. And it's about $65,000 a year on average.
Mm-hmm.
Some years less, but certainly that's the assumption I'm going on and building into this budget.
Okay.
Benefits are known. We, as you know, joined an health insurance cooperative, and our insurance premiums are really flat for this next year, so we're thrilled to death with that. So my projections in the past have assumed some good increases, but for next year we really are flat. So that's that's
Jane, one quick question.
Yes.
Is there a way at some point that I can compare prior year actual expenditures on
You
a
will-
major line item
You will
budget?
get that in July.
Okay.
For
And you have
this-
prior year and year
Yes.
prior, so several years prior?
Yes, and
Okay.
actually, in that notebook I just gave you,
Okay,
there is a section that has history, and
okay,
it breaks it down to salaries and benefits, and it
Okay.
goes back several years. It includes this year's budget, and then it shows some projections.
okay.
But in July, I will give you actuals for July 2012-13 and the 13-14 budget, so you can compare the year we're about to end actuals with next year's budget. Absolutely. But you do have some historical information in the notebook.
Chris, did you have a question?
No, I mean, the horizontal teacher movement was explained.
Okay.
And, you know, the question I have was, you know, wage for ESP, do you have a percentage on this? I mean, what are we talking about? I mean,
Oh, educational support personnel.
no, I know that, but what
Okay.
is the percentage? I
The
mean,
number FTEs.
Number.
number
Oh.
of FTEs and, you know, percentage, I mean, you know, what are we talking about? Are we going up 3%, 5%, 10%?
Well, the salaries by contract are going up 3% for
Okay,
individuals. We are still juggling FTEs at the certified level. We have eliminated one position, but we've added a position, and we're talking about some possible increases due to kindergarten, I believe. So those numbers aren't solid yet, but they're really minor in the big picture as far as FTEs go for change. Support personnel, we are eliminating a position of one classroom aide. That's probably about $12,000 a year in salary only, plus about $10,000 in benefits. Plus, they all got a 3% raise, yes.
It's really important with ESP or aides to know that that can change literally in a 24-hour time period. If a student moves in with
A one-on-one aid required in the IEP, that changes. I think the other thing, and it's on our website, but something maybe I can provide for all of them, is this year we started what I call the staffing plan, and we worked on it in January and February, and we decided on FTEs at that point. And we cut back on certain areas, and that's all available. I'll make sure I email that to all of you on Thursday. We reevaluate that in January and February of each year, but I will be discussing it with you both tonight, next week, and possibly in July to analyze our kindergarten/English language learner situation, because they're tied in together.
And the movement of the $129,000 out of this year's expense budget into a transfer, can you explain how that happened and what it is?
129,000.
Well, the budget last year was $129,000 greater than exists here on this piece of paper, and I see that it's been transferred among funds, and I didn't understand what that meant. It's a leasing payment or something?
It's the lease payments, principal and interest payments on copier leases. And
So it's a
about
one-time thing?
3 or 4 years ago, the state decided it would be a great idea. We pay that out of the education fund operating funds. But the state decided it'd be a great idea to pay that out of the debt service fund. But we have to transfer money from the education fund to cover it.
So it's a one-time thing this year and the next year?
It's ongoing.
you said it was a lease, right?
It's a copier leases, yes. It's
Right, so, yeah, that makes sense, actually,
Yes.
because it's a
Because
capital
they
lease.
don't want it to count against you in the ultimate financial profile, so we have to
Right.
do like double accounting.
Okay, got it.
And that's what it is.
Okay.
And that amount won't really change much from year to year, and you'll see that every year. I always include it, when I do a summary to the board, I include it in the education fund expenses. But
Okay.
on the state form.
That's where it was last year.
It shows it as an offset between the two funds.
Okay.
It's truly an expense out of the education fund. And Christine makes a good point, and I just miss it. I've got wages are known and been established by the board, but I didn't indicate what the amounts were. I forget, we all don't know, but it's really a 3% increase pretty much is what everyone's getting for next year. Thank you.
Are we to assume that on the IMRF, the second half of the year is the same as the first half?
IMRF
Or
rate
with
is
some-
based on the calendar year.
Right.
But ours doesn't
Minimal.
vary hardly at all.
Okay.
And from year to year, we're really not seeing,
It's almost like taking a picture. It's almost
it's
identical.
not, we've not been impacted as much. Again, purchase services, and this is probably the one area that has potential for the, I don't want to use the word volatile, but a lot of things.
That was going to be my next question. How do you define volatility? You know, I mean, what's...
For purchase services, especially in O&M, that's where maintenance repair costs are. Again, we look at history, we know what we know, what trends are. And so I do build in some contingency, of course, for repair because things can happen. But we're in pretty good shape overall, equipment-wise, vehicle-wise, and
My question was, do you have like an operation maintenance type list that would allow you to say, okay, this year we're gonna, for instance, there's a vehicle repair. I mean, do you have a vehicle replacement plan or something like this?
2 years ago, I think it was, Dr. Martindale was here, the board adopted kind of a capital expenditure plan looking at the current year, the following year, and then up to 5 years and 10 years. So we looked at big ticket items that would have to be replaced. We looked at vehicle replacement, phone system, all those things. We kind of outlined them with projected costs. So we do have that, and that's kind of what we've been looking at over the last couple of years as far as planning and budgeting goes. And a lot of the things that are included in the capital expenditures came from that plan and that review a couple
Now,
of
is
years ago.
that plan in their notebook? Is that something
No,
that
but I can certainly add it. I think
Yeah.
it's on our website, though. I think.
We'll
But it
check
needs
that
to
then
be,
first.
it's been 2 years. We need to revisit it because a lot of the things have been accomplished. We need to revisit it and update it and proceed out, so.
And that actually will happen during the strategic planning goal 3 meetings, so, because you'll do that on your
It's-
committees.
It hits the big things, but as far as, and you know, we included even parking lot and roof replacement out a few years. But certainly it's not to the level of detail that a true
Right.
facilities assessment is. So it's-
And
it's-
one last question from me.
No,
The
go ahead.
Typically, the fund balance variance, is that a function of incremental revenue coming in that you didn't expect, or savings on the expense side?
Savings on the expense side.
So typically, we budget in a comfortable way then, getting back to what Christine said earlier.
We do budget in a comfortable way. However, I try not to budget such that the budget is useless. I try to budget reality so it is a good working tool and not, I mean, I could budget anything. Anybody can budget anything. I don't want to do that. I want it to be a good working tool. I want it to be tight, but allow for
Right.
unknowns and contingencies.
And this year, it looks like we're going to be a $920,000 incremental addition to the surplus. Correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Percentage-wise, I'm trying to think, I just ran a financial report.
Yeah, I'm
Yes.
sorry to interrupt you,
That's
because
okay.
as I'm trying to wrap my hands around the budget, what is interesting is that you build contingency in the line items,
Yes,
okay? And at the same time, so you sort of over budget, you know,
in certain line
because-
items, absolutely,
Okay,
yes.
and at the same time, you know, I was trying to understand the reserve, so we levy based on the contingency. And if we don't spend, then we would have to adjust the levy in order to keep the reserve at a, in other words, you have a reserve, but you already have the contingency built in the budget. So
Correct.
it's kind of like you're covering your ass twice, if I can put it that way.
You can
Right.
put it that way.
All right,
And-
very good.
We all get it. Yes, historically, our budgets have been surplus budgets, but also within the budget, there have been contingencies built in that we've not used those contingencies. Therefore, the year-ending surplus was higher than originally budgeted.
Right, so that's something that I think we need to look at.
This is something, yes,
From
absolutely.
a strategic standpoint, you know, I mean, from a strategic plan, you know, I think that's an interesting debate that we need to have,
Yes.
you know, to what extent we build contingency, or do we do like a zero-based budget and then use the reserve as a contingency?
Which will help you then determine how you want to levy.
Yes,
Or what you want to
Absolutely.
levy.
Yes.
Right.
Absolutely.
right, does that make sense?
That's
to you?
right.
That's where you've all talked about, you know, fund reserve balances. Once you come to terms with what you believe those are at the level you're comfortable with, It's all,
It all flows.
it all fits together.
I assumed, and I'm sure that I'm not the only one to have that misunderstanding, that the reserve was actually a contingent reserve for the bonds. You know, I was under the impression that there was a bond payoff at the end of, at maturity. So now the reserve in relationship to what we need, as contingency is rather sizable. Because actually the debt service is part principal and part interest.
Yeah, and your debt service fund is really a dollar in, dollar out.
Correct.
So all your reserves are in really operating monies. Day-to-day operations, salaries, benefits, everything we do. Anything else? Well, you've gotten a good understanding, I think, on how we're budgeting. Are there any of these areas that you have specific questions on in regards to services supplies? We break these down into called object, not that you care.
I think once we get a chance to look at some of the detail.
Yes.
And I'm down to the nickel. I just want to see broad stroke line
Sure.
item detail. I think we may have more
You
questions.
will get more detail. This is the first time I've presented any information
Okay,
to
that's
you
great.
before, and next month you'll get more detail, and certainly next month you're going to get that. You're going to get every single line item, this year's actuals, next year's
Right.
budget, so we can really see it.
So in anticipation, I had some question regarding student technology. I didn't have time to get to you, but, there's $205,000 in iPad and laptops, and I think that's something that we have to look at, benchmark this, and figure out, how is that contributing to the curriculum?
Yes,
and-
absolutely.
And maybe it means testing, perhaps, there's a.
That actually fits well in with the strategic plan, because Jane, how long ago did you start the laptop initiative? 5 years ago, maybe?
Oh, no, I think it's been longer than that.
So we're already now, they start in 4th and 5th grade getting their laptops. So we need to really take a look at that, because as you know, the high school, their program is bring your own. So that's something we're gonna have to evaluate. I would also ask, before we move into that in the strategic plan, that you make yourselves available to come into the classrooms and see the kids with all the technology that we have.
Jane, I had asked you a question. I'm curious about the Park District parking lot agreement.
Okay, yeah. That agreement came about from when we sold West School in 2007. We sold West School along with, there's a parking lot that runs along Foster. And adjacent to that is all the green space. We gave all the green space to the Park District, sold the building and that parking lot to the current owner, I believe, whatever. And from that, the Park District felt that we did the wrong thing by giving the parking lot, including that in the sale, because they needed it for softball games and things like that. And so the boards negotiated and entered into an agreement that the district would build a new parking lot at that green space area. And at the time, we got a cost estimate was $80,000. That agreement was signed, I believe, in '08. So it's just, and it doesn't have a sunset, it doesn't have a deadline, it's an ongoing agreement. I budget for it every year.
Hasn't been fulfilled?
It hasn't in fact been built, has it?
No, they've never, I think they've determined well, I
Don't
won't
need the
speak for
parking
them.
lot.
So
I
you've
won't
got
speak
the
for
money in
them.
there just in case?
I budget it every year, just in case. Until such time that perhaps the agreement could
Sunset.
reach and we could reach agreement with the park district, so.
Okay.
But I'll leave that up to you folks. But we have lost history here because there's those board members no longer are here, the original agreement, so that's what that is from.
Okay.
Okay. I did kind of give you a list of capital expenditures included in this year's budget. A lot of this we have talked about in previous years, and these are just the years that are coming up. The asbestos floor tile abatement and new floor tile installation is a carryover from last year. We did common areas last year at the middle school, and this year we're doing classrooms. So that's a continuation. I indicate here I may take the abatement money out of site and construction because we have just a little bit of money left in there that'll almost cover that. So I think pay for it out of there and clean that fund out. But anyway, this kind of gives you an idea of what we're doing this summer in the district as far as equipment. And you have a question?
Yeah, is the sprinkler system at LBES, is that fire sprinkler or?
No, that's.
Okay,
that's
irrigation.
the irrigation, the
Okay.
green space. Any questions on these items or need further explanation or anything? Okay. So this is the summary.
Jane, I had a
Yeah,
question
go
that,
ahead.
that maybe it'd be just helpful
Sure.
to give it, and I think I sent an email to Jean about this. If, a brief overview of your ability or our ability to transfer between funds.
We can transfer between operating funds. If our O&M fund is out of money and we need to fix the parking lot or whatever, and we have too much money, or, no, I won't say it that way, that's terrible, Jane. If we have sufficient funds in the transportation fund, we can transfer from transportation to O&M.
I thought we couldn't move from transportation to other funds.
We can.
Is
Now-
there some funds where you cannot move from to?
I don't think IMRF, we can
Well,
we
yeah,
do?
that would go.
Okay, IMRF is not, just education, O&M, transportation.
Between those three.
Yes. Yes. And then you also have a working cash fund, which you can borrow from to an operating fund, but you have to pay it back. But you can also abate, term use, working cash, and permanently move it. It used to be the education fund only, and I believe the laws changed in that recently as well, to any of the operating funds. Okay.
Jane, I think, Leanne, I'm pretending I'm reading your mind. I think why Leanne asked that, and tell me if I'm wrong, is that we had our reserves in transportation were larger this year, and we opted to make the transportation fees go away for a year.
Yeah, we eliminated.
So why did we not, I think what I'm reading your mind is, why did we not transfer the transportation money into the ed fund?
Because the ed fund doesn't need any money.
Well, a
Well,
lot
it
of
does
funds
if
don't need
you're-
any money. That's what it is.
And here's where, and what I'm getting to is, isn't there a legal term like a fund that's desperately in need? Speaking from a layperson, there's a legal terminology for if you're in deficit in a fund, that is different. We weren't in any way in deficit in the
And you have to be in a
education fund.
deficit in order to
You
move
have
from
to
the
be-
transportation
But
fund?
what we did was we're just not accepting fees this year. Okay.
But I think the big question is why we didn't transfer transportation money into the ed fund.
Because
I mean, you could argue that maybe you would, instead of giving free bus rides to kids, that you would use that money for this expense that we have for computers or something else. And I asked about it when we were looking at it, and I was told that we couldn't move money from the transportation fund to something else.
if I said that, I misunderstood what you were asking, because we certainly can.
Okay?
But
Is there some earmarking issues?
Pardon?
Is there some funds that are earmarked for just specific,
There are such things as restricted funds.
okay, what are those?
We have very little restricted funds. Money in your debt service fund is restricted. It can only be
Right,
used
of course.
for that. We have a little bit of federal money, title grants, which are restricted for what they can be
Very
used.
restricted.
But for the most part, what we have are unrestricted monies.
Okay, all right, that's good to know.
We don't levy for tort anymore, so that we don't have those restricted funds. I don't know if we answered your question or not, Leanne.
I don't have a question, but, you know, if we talk about that again, I wouldn't change the fees to zero on buses when there are other things that we could be doing with that money.
And that may be something that we can talk further on in the strategic plan as we tie in curriculum and maybe needs in buildings and.
That was a one-year deal, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, one-year deal.
Yeah, and so people are asking why, and then they'll be confused when we bring it back, and it just,
Well, what we told people
Doesn't make a
was
lot of
that
sense.
fund is, we have almost a 2 years fund balance in transportation fund. And so to give up $75,000 a year in transportation fees, we felt was one way to help cut revenues to that fund in addition to the
Yeah, but I
the
think
lower
that,
levy.
you know, there's an interesting issue of policy here, because you levy to help the transportation fund, you see what I'm saying? But when you give the refund back, you give the refund to the users. You see what I'm saying?
This year we gave a refund to everybody.
Well, no, but, yeah, but in addition,
Yes.
you know, users of the school will get an additional 300 and some odd bucks. And so so I think that what we have to think of is the overall policy in levying money, the issues of fees, and how that affects, the greater community, the notion of means testing, and so on and so forth. So, this is done, this is water on the bridge. But I think that we need to chew on those a little bit more to figure out all the implications.
Absolutely.
And somebody's going to say, how come, you get, because you have kids in the school, whatever, $600 back, and, I don't. And I don't have anything to hang myself on, or to hang my hat to, or
I
with.
think there's one more thing to chew on that, because it's not that it's an issue here, it's just something as a board you need to be aware of, is that we have some students that waiver their fees. So that means that they have, even though we're not under the federal lunch program here, they've reached a level of poverty that we waiver their fees. And right now, we're waiving field trips. So that's something that we're going to be bringing to you in July when we discuss a little bit of policy. So you're right, all of these things tie together, and all of it will be driven through strategic planning. But it's important to point it out now, because these are big decisions we're going to be making.
One other really basic question. How do you decide, or who decides how money is allocated to each fund? Revenue. So why does the education
It's
fund?
done when we levy,
It's done when you levy.
yes. 'Cause that's the bulk of our revenue or property tax.
So the decision as to how much goes to transportation, so when transportation got so out of whack, did that just occur because
Well,
of?
I'll tell you, years ago, when we were doing projections, the transportation fund wasn't looking very good. But then we rebid it, and our fees have not escalated what we had projected originally. And we have levied the maximum amount that we could every year, while expenses have not increased as
Right,
as
so
much.
that is the other disconnect. I mean, that is the thing that we have to look at, because now we're sitting on this big reserve, and we're finding ourselves trying to sort of stabilize things. And so, levying to the max, I mean, I know, because I think that we're all schizophrenic, you know what I'm saying? We want to save money on our taxes, but, when we sit on a board, we get as much money as possible to carry the day. But I think that we really have to be aware of this and levy more cautiously, maybe?
Strategically.
And judiciously, too.
Strategically.
It is strategic, and I think it's important, as we discussed in this past year, there's ramifications for different ways of doing that too, and that's really what we're going to be learning about tonight with planning ahead for bonds and different projects that are going to be on the horizon, and et cetera, so.
Well, and when we start in a very short period of time talking about this next levy, and the board's going to determine the levy. We'll talk about the assumptions of the projections that are in your board packet. From what Liz is going to share with you assumes balanced budgets after this next year. So this year we levied knowing that the 13-14 would be a deficit budget. We knew that when we set the levy, and we're going to adopt a deficit budget this next year. We're going to spend down reserves, and we're doing that intentionally. It's a strategic move. So from this point on, the board's going to have to decide what are we going to base the levy on? We're going to base it on projected expenses next year, just to meet expenses. Is there going to be more concern about spending down reserves? So those are things that we're going to have to start talking about here in a couple of months. and for the 2013 levy, which we'll have to have set basically by November. So we'll have those conversations.
So how did we decide that we were going to deficit spend in the next budget? Where did that come from?
When we adopted this levy last year, we knew it would not cover our expenses this next year.
But in the budget that you're proposing, okay.
Yes.
Well, this is the
This was the
budget
year
for
This-
for last year's levy.
Yeah, I got it.
It's
This
that reverse
13
order
yeah.
thing.
This line right here, surplus deficit, this is the amount of dollars we anticipate spending over and above the revenues. But we
Yep.
still have plenty of money in the bank.
I understand.
Okay, so we are strategically spending down reserves, intentionally spending down reserves
Right.
to help get that.
But I think people need to keep in mind is the order of levy and budget is that
And it
the
is
budget we're
something,
doing
yeah.
now is not to prepare us for the November levy. It's how to spend the money we are getting from the past November.
Yeah, the budget, the levy you adopted in December are reflected in the revenues for the
Yes.
fiscal year 2013-14 budget.
So you go into the levy cycle a little bit blind. I mean, you have lots of history to educate, to.
As projected, yeah.
You do, but you do it hoping you have good history and are able to.
Trend data.
A good crystal ball.
Predictions.
Anything else on these numbers on the preliminary budget? Okay. You'll get more information, more detailed information, certainly in coming weeks. And
I have a question, and I apologize for not asking
No,
this in
okay.
advance, but it just occurred to me. Of all your information you have on your preliminary budget, where's the weak link? Where are you most concerned about?
You always ask that question. I don't think we. What did she say?
$12 million in reserve, but from a
As far as
business,
weaker.
from a business official point of view, that may not be the concern.
there's really, I can't see that there's any big outlier out there, Mark, because we have so many knowns this next year with the contract in place
And very little unknowns in terms of like money coming from the federal or state government or
what unknowns we have right
anything.
now are not significant.
Right.
Won't have a
Keeping in mind,
significant
though,
impact
when
on
we
the
levy
budget.
in December, we'll be levying without a teacher contract in place.
So, yeah, if we were negotiating, there's your weak link. But today, we're fortunate for next year, we know what our contract is.
Yep.
I also see, just one other quick question. Capital leases are back into 2014. Are they different than the leases we just moved out?
No, same.
So why are they back in again?
Well, the state requires us to report one way, and I report to you different, because what the state has us do is just stupid. I don't know how else to say it. They truly are an expense out of the education fund. So if I don't include them, I don't think it gives you an accurate picture. So I show them as an expense. But when you get the annual financial report from the auditors, it's not included in their expenses. It's included as another use of funds. I think it's misleading. So I show them so you know we are
Capital
actually
leases.
spending those dollars
Copiers.
towards capital leases. And
And
for us, it's just copiers.
Who's PMA? Do they run our numbers for us?
PMA serves a multitude of purposes. They have our leases, our capital leases on there. We also invest money with them. They handle some of our money. We have money in a lot of places, but that's one place. And then we also contracted them this last year to run projections. And PMA is represented here this evening by Mary Lee.
Hi.
You have a question?
Yeah, what was the cost of the projection?
I'm sorry.
What was the fee for the running the projection? Do you remember?
$8,000, $8,200?
That includes a lot of other things, though.
I think.
For instance, you could secure them for 2 or 3 different board workshops just to work on projections. There's all kinds of leverage that we can use PMA for. And the other thing we're gonna be using them for this year, which is very nice for those of you that sit on the negotiation team, is that they can actually sit in a side room and we can bring proposals into them and they'll run our numbers to figure out our projections with numbers involved in that.
Anything else? All right. Unless you want to, I wasn't going to go through these very much. These are the projections that we supplied the board last year when we had the public meetings. And we're talking about the levy and things like that. We've just updated them with what we've learned since then, what's happened this year, and then with this next year budget. So these are just updated projections. And again, John, if you see on the screen, this line right here,
Yeah.
those capital leases
Right.
as other financing sources.
Right.
That's how the state requires it, but when I give you a total of expenses at the end of the year, I put them in expenses because that's truly what they are. These
I'm
numbers-
assuming, look, if I want to make a quick assumption, since Marilee is here, if the board determines or wants to have a discussion on the fund balance policy, which I know will happen this year, I'm assuming that would be something that we could have PMA at and run numbers while they're working through, well, what about 10% and 20% and 30%?
So just looking at the education fund, and these projections assume that we levy to the maximum of our ability. So we change whatever we do, that's going to just affect the bottom line. But you can see here, this is your surplus as it reflects the percentage of total expenses. It's not declining at any great rate in the ed fund. Making that assumption. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. When we go down on the levy, okay, and then we, for 1 year, and then we levy again for the following year, there's a cap?
Well, because we,
All right, so I want you to go there because I think it matters, because that's been chewing, I mean, I've been,
because we did not levy the maximum that we could by law under the PTEL rate. This next year, we can do one of two things. We can just, if we need $10 million next year, and you determine that you want a perfectly balanced budget the following year, dollar in, dollar out across the board to make it easy, we levy $10 million. If you want to levy the maximum that we can under PTEL, one of two things is going to happen. We can reach back prior to this last levy to reach, because in the PTEL formula, it's based on previous year's extensions. But because we under levied, automatically we're going to get less money from here on out. However, we can reach back as far as 3 years.
so there's a clawback.
Yes,
provision.
yes. So although we cut our levy $3 million, this next year we don't necessarily have to start from that if we don't want to. We can reach back up
Okay,
to 3
so
years for higher extensions.
that was a question that I had.
Yes.
I was concerned
And
about.
the board knew that when they started to levy, so in case we get into this next year and projections are looking, kind of, wait a minute, we can reach back up to 3 years.
But going forward, we have to be cognizant of that,
Yes.
that we
yeah.
don't under
So,
levy
yes.
for X number of years, so we, at one point our expenses, we can't cover them anymore.
Exactly. But, you know, and we're focusing on the revenue side, we also got to talk about the expense side
Yeah.
down the road too. So go hand in hand. Okay. I can almost see these. I'm going to skip the graphs. This is an O&M fund, and again, I'm just going to focus here on the fund balance. We are seeing, projected-wise, this number really getting down because we're looking at some expenses. We're going to analyze that in a much greater detail and see exactly what assumptions we're making, looking at future capital expenditures, what we need to do, revisit these projections, is what I'm saying, to see where we're going. If there's changes we need to make now, decisions we need to make now for the future to avoid getting down this low. That's what we'll talk about, and we'll make decisions now to avoid getting to that point. But we're spending a pretty good chunk of money this next year that are all really one-time expenditures. So.
That was that list you gave us earlier on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And again, we have $80,000 a year in there, Park District, that we don't spend.
And the strategic planning dollars will fit into the projections so that you can actually kind of plan out X amount of years. I always give the example of a swimming pool because we know we're not going to put a swimming pool in. Everyone knows I'm a big swim mom, so let's say the strategic plan dictated we're going to put a pool at the middle school. We could actually plan out if we're going to put that in 3 years, and then we fit it into all our projections and plan that out. That's why Board Goal 3 is so important, to really hash down needs in our district for both just the typical building needs, but as well as programming needs. If we talked about STEM labs, what would that cost? That's another good example.
Let's be clear, though, that there is no pool in the works. Just,
There is no pool.
there's no
This is how
pool
rumors
or-
get started,
Yeah,
folks.
Please.
I always give that example because I only know one school in the whole state of Illinois that has a pool at a middle school.
We have a
So-
pool.
Oh, I used to work at one, so. there's
I'm
another
talking
one
at
out
a
there.
middle school.
I used to work at one, so.
Well, that is a rumor, it's just an example.
We've had conversations about what level the reserve funds should be at, and that it might be different for one fund than another. But I'm kind of curious, looking at the projection in this one, so we're down to 3.74% in 2017, and back up a little bit the following year. Just curious why we're looking at it that way, as opposed to saying going down to 20% or going down to
We
zero,
didn't
or...
select that as a target. We just projected out what we think revenues and expenses will be, and that's,
If we keep going in the
Based
part the way
on-
we're heading.
Revenues and expenses will be based on what? That we're going to continue reducing the levy, or?
no,
We have not decided that.
based on levying as much as we can, but the way our expense trend has been, making assumptions on what expenses are going to be, and that's different. That's why I say
Okay.
we need to really dig down into
Uh-huh.
that.
You said earlier when I asked a question about how the amounts are allocated, that that's a function of levy for
Yes.
each. So we can choose how to levy on these things, correct?
Well, you can to a point. You
What are
can't-
the rules for levying?
Well, there are, within each levy, so you have a levy for the ed fund, O&M fund, transportation fund, et cetera. They are limited, and in your notebooks, there's some information in there. They are limited on the rate, and we can't necessarily increase the rate from year to year. You don't have that problem with IMRF, you don't have that problem with debt. Those are only two, but you cannot necessarily levy to increase the rate outside of the PTEL.
Without a
formula.
rough,
It's the best way I can explain it to you.
That's the 5% or CPI rule,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Yeah, well, that's the case for everybody.
Unless you-
Yes, it
unless
is
you
the
have
same
referendum.
for
So that's
everybody.
not,
That's
you know,
exactly right. It is
so-
the same,
right.
it's the same formula.
So it's, yeah.
We'll have, I'll put together some more information presentation on the levy and taxes, because we'll be talking about that coming up. But our revenues are approximately 97% property taxes in this district. So that is our revenues. We get a little bit of state money, tiny bit of federal money, but pretty much we are property tax funded in this school district.
So just to be clear then, so you assess the levy, you determine, let's say we decide to go with the maximum levy, as you stated, and the money gets into each fund, then that's a separate decision. Here's the amount we're going to levy in total, and then we place it
No,
into the
when you
buckets, or
levy-
no? You levy for each?
You levy a dollar amount for education fund. You
Okay.
levy a dollar amount for O&M. So when you adopt a levy, you adopt several different amounts for each fund and purpose. So
Dollar
we
wise.
don't levy just an aggregate amount, and then we decide how much goes where. You determine it when you levy, how much is for ed, how much O&M, how much for transportation.
So then, this is what's happening. So if the EAV goes up,
You're good.
then we look like god and goddesses because the tax rate goes down.
Correct.
Correct. But if the EAV is flat, then we have to make sure that we stay within the 5% CPI rule.
Yeah, the PTEL, yeah, the formula is gonna calculate what that
Correct.
maximum rate
But
is.
you don't know EAV until after you've levied. So there's
Yeah,
another
but
twist
you know
in the whole
what?
thing.
I'm not too concerned about that.
It's gonna go down.
No, so,
Yeah, those three pieces have to converge, you know, they have to get, the county tells you your EAV, and then we give them dollars, and
In your notebooks, there's a whole section on the tax levy, and it gives you the actual PTEL formula, and I think it's got some good information in there, but certainly this is something we'll need to talk about extensively as we approach the fall and start talking about next year's levy, and what our
Jane,
goal
what I
is
have
with
in-
that.
In my notes for this is, we're gonna send the board the facility schedule that was worked on a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
With Ben, and I'm gonna send them the staffing plan.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Yes. Anything else as far as projections? I mean, you can look at these, and again, they are the same projections, but have been updated slightly with this next year's preliminary budget and what we know. But your projections, again, they're dynamic. They change regularly, and we need to revisit those and update them on a regular basis, and we'll do so at least twice a year.
does the flexibility, I tend to gravitate toward the aggregate number, just when I look at these, as opposed to spending a lot of time on the individual funds. But does the flexibility you have within the law to move monies between funds alleviate the concern that one might have, or your concern when we look at some of these charts and we see red everywhere on
Well,
everything but the
certainly-
education fund?
Certainly, the O&M fund causes me some.
Worry.
Worry, but
Because
if
it'll,
our transportation fund looks to continue to be very healthy, there's a safety net there, and our working cash. is-
because the O&M fund is the most volatile, right?
Yes.
Is that what it is? That's the one where you have the
But the projections don't look very good at the moment.
what is OM again?
operations and maintenance.
Maintenance and operations.
But in
But
aggregate,
that's, you have a lot of control over that, too.
yeah, and in aggregate, at the end of the day, we still have 72% in reserve, so I'm not
I
too,
mean, you know. Right.
It's good to look at individual funds, just so you recognize that
Right.
the fund is sick. That's why I call them sick. But if everything else is healthy,
but we made
You-
it sick because we didn't levy appropriately for that particular fund, from what I'm understanding, correct? It was our choice.
if we under levied, yes, it was our choice.
Right, okay.
As is this year, correct.
It was a planned sickness.
It was a strategic, it was a strategic.
Inoculation.
Inoculation. Oh, good.
Okay. I think, you guys understand this. With that, anything else on preliminary budget, et cetera, before we get to bonds discussion?
Read these notebooks, you're gonna love them.
Well, this combined with the book that I gave
I
you.
don't know that you'll love it, but I think it can be a good resource.
It is, I've gone back to mine many times.
And I regret not having kept those updated for you the last couple of years, but.
So, compare this to,
That's from Mr. Dahlman to me, to you.
Oh, is this for me? Okay,
Yes,
thanks.
so I thought you wanted to take a look
Okay,
at it.
thanks.
Jane, there's one additional question on the fund
Sure.
levies. So, I understand the PTEL cap, I think. That applies not only at the aggregate level, but also at each fund level? So if we levied, say, .05 or some small
Well-
number in a particular fund, the next year we couldn't exceed the PTEL cap on that fund, or is it solely
This year, we,
on the aggregate?
when we get the extensions from the county, To some degree, usually, historically, your rate drops every year because the AVs go
The
up.
AV goes up, yes.
You know, and so we get the extensions, and we can move pennies among the funds as we see fit.
Okay.
So if I want to take 3 cents away from transportation and put it to the ed fund, you know, we can do that. But if last year's ed fund rate was $1.50, I can't raise it above the $1.50. Is that correct? Yeah, I know, but I mean, what last year's rate was, you can't increase it. Because I tried this year to move a penny or two between, because I tried to take like a half a cent from working cash and move it somewhere, and the county said, you can't do that, you're increasing the rate from, you can't do it. So there are limitations among the funds. You can't increase the individual. If the total, you can't increase the rate among the individual funds from one year to the next.
Above the tell.
Yes. So there are limitations.
The tax cap.
We can sometimes move some few cents among them, but to a limited degree.
So it's great that we have reserve funds,
It is great.
but where you have a fund that's getting, in the projection, getting down to 3%.
You can't just
you
jack
have-
up that.
we have to make a
that levy and
long-term
increase
plan
that
for-
rate. That's right.
Making it
That's exactly right.
To make that.
stand where it needs to be.
That's exactly right. Which is why we look at projections, so.
And it's another reason to have a policy that talks about fund balances in each fund,
Yes,
In each fund.
so to maintain the health of each one.
yes. Did we answer your question? Okay.
Okay.
Moving on.
Anything else before we move to bonds?
I think we're bond ready.
We're bond ready. Okay. Liz, we're ready for you, and I'll get your PowerPoint
I have to cleanse.
up here.
This is the hardest part.
Yeah, you need the,
Oh, I gotta get the microphone. Okay.
thanks for coming.
You're welcome. Okay, tonight what I'm going to do is go over, first of all, who I am and what I do and when I started working with the district. Then I'm trying to give you a history of your bonded indebtedness, starting with the 2008 referendum bond, going forward. Then to look at some options for abatement, which I'll get into that definition a little more. You did an abatement last year, I'll explain that. And then options that you may or may not want to consider for restructuring your debt. Okay? All right, so I've been with William Blair for 25 years. I have my MBA, and I've worked with school districts that whole time, specifically in Illinois, and we are a leader in school district finance. This is our top 10 senior managing underwriters of Illinois school districts in 2012. And you can see we were ranked number 2 behind Goldman Sachs, who did one bond issue for the Chicago Public Schools at $468 million. So, and we did something like 33 school district bonds.
Can you explain for the larger audience what an underwriter is as opposed to financial advisor? Because I think that's germane to the conversation.
Sure. At William Blair, we can act as either financial advisor or bond underwriter. A financial advisor helps an issuer structure a bond issue, helps them with a rating, and then can bring the sale to market through either a competitive or a negotiated bond sale. A competitive bond sale is when other firms like ours compete to purchase the entire bond issue. Okay, and whoever submits the lowest all-in true interest cost for the bonds is awarded that. So that's very similar to competitive bidding that you do for a lot of the construction work and whatnot. In a negotiated underwriter, you would work with a bond underwriter, and we often work in that role too, as you can see, where we basically do all the same things the financial advisor does in terms of helping you structure the debt, getting your bond rating in place, getting the issue ready for market, but then we utilize our bond sales force, which is a group of bond salesmen who have tax-exempt customers nationwide, who use their contacts to sell the bonds through a negotiated bond sale. In a negotiated bond sale, you negotiate the fee up front, so that fee is known, and you are selling the bonds through a bond sale directly to the end investor, as opposed to broker-dealers who will then, acting as middlemen, turn around and sell it to investors.
How do you avoid the conflict of interest? Do you wall off the department somehow, or?
Conflict of interest in what
between
way?
advising and placing.
Well-
You're advising on one hand, and then you're placing the same bond.
As a public finance bond underwriter, our job is to put together issuers and investors. We are your access to the capital markets. And where our duty per G17 of the MSRB, which I'll be happy to share with you.
Talk to you about that.
That would be fine. By law, we must treat our issuers fairly, like the school districts, as well as investors. So, for example, we could not sell bonds with interest rates so low such to the school district's benefit that the investors who purchase those bonds get a bad deal. Similarly, we cannot sell bonds with interest rates so high that turns out to be a bad deal for you, but a great deal for the investors. That is our role per law, to act as the bridge between the issuers and the investing public. So, and what we do when we negotiate when we negotiate deals, is we provide issuers with a comparative interest rate analysis before, during, and after the sale. I've got an example in here for Lake Forest High School for an issue we just completed with them, so I'll be happy to share that with you.
I'm sorry, you said you have an example from Lake Forest High School?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good.
Yeah. So hopefully, it's a complicated discussion, but hopefully that gave you an idea between the roles of a financial advisor and an underwriter. And the Dodd-Frank law, which you perhaps have read about, is being written as we speak, trying to put a definition on what a municipal advisor actually is and what is their role and responsibilities, because up until now, financial advisors have not had any regulation, whereas broker-dealers or underwriters are overseen by the SEC, the MSRB, have to take many different tests. So right now, they're coming up with these same rules for financial advisor. They haven't gotten there yet, maybe within the next year. So, all right. Now, Jane, if you want to keep going. Oh, you did. Okay, that's 2011. Our services, working with school districts, cash flow needs, refunding opportunities, restructuring, financial projections. We help districts with negotiating tax increment financing agreements with municipalities, full-service rating agency presentations, advisory regarding tax rate referenda, bond referenda. So we really have kind of a full service. One thing we do want to make sure our clients are in compliance with is what's called dissemination agent services. This is a real hot button with SEC right now, and we work with your district to make sure information in your offering statement is updated on an annual basis and filed with the MSRB. Go ahead. These are tombstones. No, we did not kill these issuers, but these are examples of issuers we've worked with in 2012. I'm sure you see some familiar school districts, but then here's some 2011 school districts too. Here's our school district clients, mostly clustered around the Collier County and Cook County area, and we also have some clients downstate. And here's another thing on the role of underwriter and financial advisor, so you can kind of go back to refer to this. The underwriter is a gatekeeper of the capital markets, putting issuers together with investors via negotiated bond sale. A financial advisor will help determine whether it's better to pursue a competitive bond sale or a negotiated bond sale, okay? And that depends on market conditions, the size of your issue, what your bond rating is, which type of those sales works best for you. I talked about the other things, determining the debt structure, repayment terms, security, rating agency. That stuff's pretty much the same. And then an underwriter in a negotiated sale brings the issue to market to their sales force through a negotiated sale, which is, don't think there's no competition there. It's like eBay for bonds in that the salesmen compete against each other on a maturity by maturity basis. Whoever can find the customer who's willing to take the lowest interest rate will in fact get that order. So there is competition in a negotiated sale. In a competitive sale, there's competition as well, but it's between broker-dealers to purchase the whole bond issue, okay, in a bid scenario.
So as to these two roles, an underwriter such as William Blair can serve both simultaneously, I take it?
No, I can either be the underwriter in a negotiated sale or a financial advisor in a competitive sale.
Oh, I see, in a competitive sale, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so that's just a little background, comparable pricing analysis. I won't read through all this, but Jane, if you want to go to the next slide, what we've got here is just kind of the comparative pricing analysis that we bring to an issuer when the bonds are sold. And I just thought I'd show you this because it's Lake Forest High School, it's your high school district. And we just completed this at the end of April. And I think the key columns to look at are the yield column and then the spread. The spread represents the number of basis points over the nationwide AAA municipal market index that these bonds were priced. And you might think, gosh, Lake Forest is a AAA, they should be on the index. They should be, but we are located in the state of Illinois. So we have a spread to that nationwide AAA rated index. But as you can see, that spread is pretty low, and the yields are very low. The person who bought the 2014 issue is getting a return of 0.38%. The person who bought the 2023 maturity gets a return of 2.03%. And you can compare that with other issues in the market in that same time frame. And we show the Schaumburg Park District in Batavia. Batavia is a AA1, just one notch below the AAA at Lake Forest 115, and the Schaumburg Park District is a AA2. So they, Lake Forest should have lower yields and lower spreads than they do, and this is just an example.
Just for review, what's our rating here?
AA3.
AA2.
AA2?
AA3.
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 Well, I think that's from, is that
This
from,
is,
when's
what
that
it
printed
says
out?
I
on
just
your
pulled this off.
AA3.
Okay,
What are you folks looking at?
The rating,
Oh,
because I was just
Underlying.
wondering what date you pulled that off. If it's recent, then,
2010.
I got
That
this
was
from
on the
June-
2010
January
geo
2010.
geo bonds.
okay. Now, this is kind of complicated, but if you recall, with the big crisis, the rating agencies are under a lot of pressure because they had a more stringent rating methodology for municipalities than they do for corporate bonds. So there was a recalibration of all bond ratings. So this prints out as AA3 from 2010. Later that year, in 2010, they did a recalibration of all ratings. So some ratings moved up one step, some moved up two steps. So I think if we go to the recalibration, it will show you as a AA2, even though when that was initially done, you were a AA3.
and in 2008, what were we, in 2008 when we issued?
I think those were insured, actually.
Well,
A
it's-
AA3 underlying with an insured rating.
The 24 million was FSA insured.
Okay.
They were AAA back then, and the district's underlying rating, if I'm not mistaken, was AA3 back in '08.
Yes, that's what it says right there.
Okay.
So now
Okay.
this is very interesting for what's happening currently in the market. and
Yes.
The yields are very low. Any idea what that looked like in '08? I just am,
I have your all-in interest cost for the '08 issue on here.
what did comparable issues look like in '08? Because that's what I find very interesting, is these three set side by side. Do we have anything any other comparable issues in the '08 data?
You know, we can find that out for you. We did not work on your '08 issue. A
Okay.
different bank did, but we can go back and find those comparables for you if you're interested.
I don't know whether it'll turn out being relevant or not.
Yep.
But it just strikes me, these yields and these coupon numbers strike me as different than what we have from our '08.
Yes. It was a different market then,
Yes,
for sure.
right. And I'd like to know what other,
Sure.
other comparable issues we're getting at the time.
Okay, we can do that. So that's about us and what we do and how we work with school districts. What I want to do now is turn to the district and your outstanding debt service. You have two issues out. The 2010 issue, which was issued for refunding purposes. It was issued to flatten the debt service at $1.2 million a year for 6 years, back in 2010. So it went through 2014 levy year. And the idea was, I'll get more into that, the debt structure, but back in 2010, that's when I first started working with the district. And the 2008 issue, the board was worried because we were just heading into the Great Recession and the financial crisis. What would the effect of that be? EAV started to waver down, and so they wanted to flatten the debt service to keep taxes low for the next 4 years by restructuring a piece of that 2008 issue.
Intent was we knew that the operating tax rate was going to go up, and so the board wanted to try to help mitigate that, and so we did this, hoping we could save on the debt rate to mitigate what the operating rate was going to do. And I think we
You may
saved-
want to speak in the microphone.
Oh. Yeah, the board's intent when we did this 2010 refunding was because we knew the EAV was going down, the operating rate, tax rate was going to go up, so we wanted to lower the debt rate, whatever we could, to help offset the increase in the operating rate, which I think we saved maybe 2 cents on the debt rate, but it's what we could do. But that was the intent, the board's intent for that refunding in 2010.
Okay, and then the 2008 bonds, you can see the debt structure there. The shaded bonds are callable, meaning those bonds can be redeemed prior to maturity. Typically, municipal bonds have call protection for the first 10 years. Unlike mortgages, purchasers of municipal bonds do not accept at a price a bond that is callable sooner than 8 to 10 years, because they want to at least get their interest payments for that amount of time. And if interest rates go down like they have, it's pretty sure they're going to get refunded and taken away from them. Okay?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that. It's pretty sure.
It's pretty sure that with rates going down like they have over the last 5 years, that if the bonds are callable, they will be refunded and taken away from the original investor.
That's why there's a 10-year limitation, otherwise no one would purchase the bonds. because
Right, they could
they're
be
very little
refunded,
value.
just like mortgages are refunded so often and time and
As soon
time.
as the rate goes down, they're going to refinance, and my bond won't be of any value. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay. Yep. Okay, just a brief overview of the types of municipal bonds school districts can issue. The first one is tax-exempt bonds that are approved by referendum for capital projects, such as the bonds that were authorized in 2008. Those were approved by the voters. They were general obligation bonds, and general obligation bonds are guaranteed by the full faith and credit of an unlimited tax levy of the bond and interest fund. And that kind of goes back to what Jane said. You were asking about what funds don't have any maximum rates. The bond fund does not have a maximum rate, okay? So, you have flexibility there. Another type of debt that school districts can issue and do often, actually, like Forest High School just did, that was what they did, is called a debt certificate. Those are paid from the operating funds of the district. They don't require any referendum or any petition period. They worked the payments into their O&M debt schedule, or budget, O&M budget, so they can afford the payments. They're going to pay them off in 10 years, and they're going to fix the track. And that situation. So that's another type.
3.6 that you just
Correct.
referenced? Okay.
So there's no public authorization for that, simply the board passes a resolution to issue those debt certificates because it's being paid off within its operating funds. They're not increasing levies for that purpose.
And what was that called again?
Debt certificate?
So reserves could be used in that case?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. I already talked a little bit about optional redemption and callability, that municipal bonds require 8 to 10-year call protection for the investor. Otherwise, the investor would charge a much higher rate. And then I just want to talk a little bit about refunding options and how it relates to that call date.
Just, what kind of increase are you talking about in rates when you're saying they'd have to pay a much higher rate? to have a
You know,
call?
it varies depending on market conditions, but it can be up to 1% higher, you know, if you've got to want them callable at any time. It would be treated, you know, very differently. It's very unconventional.
Yeah, there'd be no financial incentive to do so, correct?
Correct. Disincentive. Mhm.
Disincentive.
So by 1% higher, just to make sure I'm following, and looking back at the Lake Forest example, the yield in the first year is 0.38, right? Are you saying 1% above that? So
Yeah, on the whole deal.
1.38?
Yeah, if it was callable at any time, I'm sure we'd have, you know, much higher
Okay.
rates. Okay, so you can refund the bonds at the call date and just call in the bonds away from the investors on a 30-day notice and reissue bonds, or if you have cash, pay them off with cash. You can also refund the bonds in advance of the call date. So the 2008 bonds are callable, I believe, in December 30th, 2018. That's that 10-year call protection, okay? So we could refund those bonds now. And what we do is set up an escrow that would be at a bank, and we'd issue new bonds, the proceeds of which would go into that escrow account, invested in treasury securities or obligations of the U.S. government that would mature on the call date, and then the bonds would be called away from those investors at that time. In the meantime, we would have issued new bonds that would have taken the place of those 08 bonds we refunded in advance of the call date at a lower interest rate. Now, our firm, we watch these things, so we would be able to come to Jane and say, rates are so low, we better refund those 08 bonds in advance of the call date and save the taxpayer some money. The problem is, interest rates are so low in the short-term investment market that we can't earn enough interest in that escrow that's invested from, for example, today until December 30th, 2018, that because we have to put more proceeds, bigger bond issue, more proceeds in that escrow fund because the interest rates are so low in the short term, 5 years, especially for U.S. Treasuries, that it creates savings.
But
So
would the savings be at hand in the difference between the old bonds and the reissuing of the new bonds to offset that low interest?
right, it does offset because our new bonds are issued at very low interest rates, but the amount we have to issue to take out the existing 2008 bonds is higher than it otherwise would be if we had higher short-term interest rates.
Could we abate some of those so that we lowered the amount that needed to be reissued?
You could use cash
Right.
in the refunding,
Right.
yes, you
So
could
you-
definitely do that, yes.
Okay. That's an option we might want to look at.
It is.
Okay.
That's definitely possible. But the reason I haven't come to you and said, oh my gosh, let's refund these 08 bonds for savings to the taxpayers is because the numbers are not working with a refunding bond issue because of those very low short-term interest rates. And that's what we refer to as negative arbitrage. It's the difference between the yield on the old bonds and the short-term interest rates. Okay? Now, I'm digressing, and that's bad because I know we've got a lot to cover tonight. There are some alternative investments you could put in that escrow that have a higher yield that may make this refunding work better, such as taxable bonds of the state of Illinois.
Let's double down. We aren't exposed enough. We aren't exposed enough to Illinois debt problems. Let's expose ourselves
Well,
again.
I'm kind of,
And the next option?
yes. Well, they just got downgraded, A3, A minus. So the rates are really good right now. So anyway, that's one option. Putting other municipal bonds in that escrow is another option, although you don't get as good of a yield kick, obviously, from other AA municipal bonds than you do from state of
Just a
Illinois
quick
bonds.
question. If we were to go out and do this today, what rate would we get on this sort of issue?
On the new
On the
issue,
2008 issues, if we were today seeking to secure bonds for this $24 million, and we received this at 3.5, beginning at 3.5, escalating 4 and on up to 5, what would they be today if we were to do that?
That's a good question. I can't answer it with much accuracy without running it because every maturity has a different rate.
Just roughly, the differential, let's say, between.
I'd say on average right now, you could probably refund that bond for 2%, or not 2%, 3% or under. Maybe hearing rates have been going up a little dramatically the last 2 weeks, so the wonderful low rates that we've enjoyed for the last 3 years have kind of started to slip away. But I would say on average, you'd have something like a 3%. We just did a bond sale last week, and it was a 20-year level debt structure, which is going to be a little more, little lower than what you would have at right around 3%. Okay. Now, bonds may also be refunded, not only for savings, but to restructure your debt. So if you don't like your payment schedule, you don't like what it looks like because it's increasing from the 2008 issue, you can refund and stretch out. We have a 20-year limitation under the law. We cannot go more than 20 years.
20 years from the new issue date.
Right.
Okay.
So we could.
So it would be 20 years from today, 2033 would
Correct.
be the limit. That's as far as you can go under the law.
Yes.
And that is because it's somewhat connected to, we paid for the school with this, so that would be the years of useful life of the building? Is that the logic?
Well, that's kind of the thought, but honestly, back in 2008 when you issued those bonds, I'm sure that school is going to last longer than 20 years.
Right.
I'd say the lives of these buildings is, 25, 30, you all see 50-year-old school districts. But unfortunately, the law limits us to 20 years. So in 2008, you had to issue that $24 million to fit within 20 years. Now, having said that, more and more school districts, especially under this kind of stressful fiscal environment, are going to the legislator and writing their own legislation to extend their maturity to 25 years. So, for example, Highland Park just passed a referendum for $89 million. They went to the legislature and got them to amend something, add their bill in to extend their debt to 25 years. So for their new facilities that they just got approved, they're going to be able to issue it over 25 years. So this is a much more common thing than it used to be, but our statute on its own limits us to 20 years.
So if we were to refi, I want to make sure about this, in 2018, we'd have to, it would be 2038?
You
And
could.
Is it a new thing? Do you reset the clock? This is what I'm asking.
Correct.
Okay.
So that's how some of your examples extend out to 2040 something.
Yeah. Okay, back to the 2008 referendum. Now, this is the original issue. In the light green, you can see what the EAV did from 2008 through 2012. Those are actual numbers. We've estimated about a 1.51% decrease for 2013. No idea. We'll see what happens. And then to be conservative, just 0% after that.
And the difference between, I try to tie numbers out, the difference between the debt service on the original schedule and this debt service is the timing, because this is a levy year and the other one's a fiscal year, is that?
Well, that's one difference, but this is the original 08 issue. And you see how the payments in 2009 are about $1,370,000, and then they go up to 1.4 and 1.5 and 1.58.
Right.
Your actual levies are for those years are more like 1.2 million.
Right.
Why?
Right.
Because we refunded in 2010 to reduce those payments, because already in 2010, the board that was sitting in those chairs then felt the pressure of the Great Recession, declining EAV. Jane's got more.
It was strictly to try to bring the rate down, total tax rate down.
So that's the difference there.
Yeah. But just going back to '08, I thought this would be a good reference
Hang on
for
a
you.
minute. I got a question. I mean, so there was not was it an issue of cash flow or an issue of tax rate?
I'm sorry?
Was it an issue of cash flow or an issue of tax rate?
Tax rate.
And it had to do with, I'm trying to understand this, because I think the tax rate is a bit of a bugaboo. You know what I'm saying? Because we do not control the tax rate, because we do not control the EAV.
I know, but as we knew the EAV was going down, so we knew the operating rate was going to go up. So this was the one way they could help keep the rate down.
Yeah,
That was the motivation and the strategy at the time.
yeah.
Okay, now, I wasn't in this room in 2008, but as you can see, the payments kind of go up like 4 or 5% a year. I think the district's EAV prior to 2008 was going up between 5 and 7% a year with home additions, expansions, some new growth. And so their assumption in '08 was a 4.5% to 5% increase in the EAV going into the future seemed not unreasonable. So that's why you've got debt payments that are increasing. Now, when we see what's actually happened with the declines in the flat tax rate, the tax rate for debt service is going to go up as those payments go up, and taxes will go up due to the debt. This type of structure is not uncommon for school districts in Illinois, especially school districts in areas where there's regenerating, increasing home values, tear downs, new construction, that kind of thing.
Wasn't there a lot of talk about a housing bubble back in 2007, 2008? Was there no one thinking about that at that time?
It's not a rhetorical question.
You weren't here. In 2007, as I recall, and our financial advisors at the time, we thought we were being conservative and looking at projected EAV growth. And I can go back and look at the records, but it seemed like we started out at like 5 and then went down to 3 and took that out, thinking at that time it would be conservative. Obviously, I don't think anybody thought we would see these kinds of declines in EAV. Nobody thought they'd see a decline in EAV.
Actually, 8% in Lake County has been the historical average for increase in EAV in entire Lake County. Lake Bluff is more landlocked, so you don't have new construction, which comes into the EAV, correct?
Correct.
It was not unreasonable to take this down. At the same time, this is a 3-year cycle. So, it is most likely that as the real estate market, I hear is picking up. Now, are the price going up? I don't know. I don't know enough to know that. But now what you have with 2012 EAV is that really you have 3 rotten years of data. And so,
Good data, rotten years.
well, it's a 3-year cycle, so you're going to lag on EAV behind the market, and you were still maintaining yourself in 2008 with the 757, which was already more than what the EAV actually was.
Well, going 0% out to 2026, obviously, we like to think that's ultra-conservative, that we'd see any growth. I don't know where we are with Stonebridge, but certainly if that development continues, that will help us. But even if we see small incremental increases, let's just say 2%, 3%, then the debt service tax rate will be slightly lower than what's illustrated here
I
with
would
the 0%
prefer to take a
growth.
very conservative approach.
I
'cause
agree
it's all
with you,
on the-
Don.
I mean, I'm
So-
saying, I think I'm the one that suggested 0%.
Correct.
I think then we're all on the upside, so. I'd
Yeah,
rather
oh,
be on
and
the
we,
upside
we,
than on the
we
downside.
like to try to be ultra-conservative too, because it gives you at least a foundation.
Right.
You're not going to be exactly that, but if you're slightly increased, we know.
That's a good thing.
So we hope that this is a conservative projection.
But this is based on what it was in 2008. This has changed now. This
Yes.
chart has changed.
Yes. So this was 2008. Your average cost then was 4.655%. So let's go to the next one. There's a graph. The payments, you can see, are going up, and the tax rate with a zero growth is going up as well. The tax rate axis is on the right side. The dollar payments are on the left side. Okay? Now, in 2010, we refunded bonds. The numbers highlighted in blue are the numbers that are from the original debt and were refunded, with a middle column that says less refunded bonds, and that's both principal and interest that's been refunded. And then we issued new bonds, the 2010 refunding bonds, that paid interest only until 2027. Why did we do that? Because if you look at the total debt schedule, all the other years are taken up with some big payments, and we wanted to extend that payment, wrap it around, and make it as impact neutral as we could to the whole debt schedule. However, we have to pay interest. Okay, we could issue a different type of bond that has zero interest, but those are super costly. Those are zero coupon bonds, so we try to avoid those. So the green box is what the resulting new debt service and current debt service is for 09 through 2014. Okay, so you can see the tax rate stayed pretty well put in 2009, 10, 11, and then the EAV went down big in 2012, and so now it's kind of popped up to 20 cents and 21 cents.
Your concept here was that the 2008 bonds disappear in 2026, and then in 27 you make this incremental payment, so you have even payments for those 2 years. That was your concept at that
The
time.
concept was to try to keep the debt service level out at the long end. So
Right.
you can see the last payment was like 3.1, with the interest is now 3.2, and then 2.8 in that very last year.
Okay.
Wrapping it around, if you would, just extending it 1 year, not more than that, for that time period. Now, I think the thinking in 2010 was if we stabilize it for 5 years, we'll come back in 2015 and see how we're doing. See what's happening. Have we recovered? Has, property values recovered? Is there new growth? So that's why in 2015, under the line, you see the debt service jumps up now from 1.2 million to 1.9 million. Okay? So let's wait and see. Let's just take care of these 5 years, come back, see what's going on in the economy.
Just to personally clarify something, so the cost to the district of refunding that portion is the difference between that $5 million and the $2.9 million.
That's
Right?
correct.
So $2.1 million was the cost over 20
Correct.
years of that refunding to smooth that out.
Yes, that's correct.
So anytime we do anything like that in the future, if we decide that that's appropriate, we have to be aware of that long-term cost.
Yeah, of course, in
Right.
I mean, I've been thinking about this a little bit. When you build a school for 50 years, why should the current generation pay for that school when future generations are also going to use that school? So extending it out doesn't necessarily personally bother me very much, because you're penalizing, especially the older people who aren't going to be here 20 years from now. They're paying for your school today. So let future generations who bring new kids into the school share that burden. I have no problem with that.
That is often the thinking, and that's also part of the thinking in the original debt structure as the payments get higher, because you've got future
Right.
users.
With new kids.
That's a very valid point.
Which is the argument against trying to pay off this loan? I mean, one of the scenarios is that we do like lump sum
Absolutely.
payment, and that would actually penalizing
Yep.
current users
Right.
or residents. And that's probably something we need to have in strategic discussion. you know, I mean, you know, how do we fund schools, you know, in an equitable manner across generation? I mean, we do this with capital expenditure in the village all the time. When you have $10 million of waterworks, you cannot have people that are in the village now pay for benefits that are going to be extending for a couple of generations.
I hear what you're saying, and I think there's a lot to that. What I'm confused about is we can't be the only ones with this problem. I mean, how are other school districts doing just what Christine is talking about? You know, ensuring that the folks who actually get the benefit of the school are the ones who are paying for it over time.
I'm guessing there aren't a lot of schools being built, are there?
Well, not at the moment, not at the
Not at
moment,
the
but
moment,
really
but this
5-10 years ago,
hasn't
tons of
changed.
schools being built with debt structures that go just exactly like your graph shows, with the whole idea, especially when you go to referendum, you're going to ask people for more money to build a school, and you need to tell them how much it costs. And if you think you've got growth in your district, you want to spread it equitably between the people that live there now and the people that are going to come in the future. And if you anticipate some growth, then that back-end weighted debt schedule makes sense because it's being spread equally among the new people that are coming. In your district was, you know, as Jane mentioned, you're landlocked, it's not a high growth, although if you look back at your EAV increases with some of the tear downs and rebuilds, there was, you know, some good increases. But what about just an inflation factor, you know, on your debt schedule? That's
Right, because this is, if you
something
do
to think about,
present
too.
value money, I mean, you know, $2,898,000 in 2027 is not what it's worth today.
Right.
So you'd have to figure out, you know, some sort of discount rate to figure out exactly what would be the cost today of those $2,898,000 in
Future
20.
dollars.
Right, the PV cost is very small compared to the future value, but you're right, over time it is certainly the more interest.
Is one difference that we just have two schools, right? And so we don't anticipate doing lots of these, right? We have one school that'll be 50 years and another school that, you know, we hope to not be replacing in 2026, right? So it may be in other districts, there's more of a level flow because one generation pays for this school and then the next generation pays for that school and then the next generation pays for the following school. But we have these relatively limited need for new schools, right?
Right,
Two
I
new
mean,
schools.
and it depends on your enrollment, but even, I'm sure you
So
have
we have to
capacity,
flag,
right? You have
we're-
capacity,
But we
or
can-
a little bit, just a little bit? Okay, well,
But we
that's
still
something to
have,
think about.
and you've suggested several options, and I'd like to talk about those at some point to flatten this out, to make it more equitable over the longer term. So I'm hopeful.
Okay, sorry.
I'm very
spending too
hopeful
much
too,
time.
John. I don't want to get us derailed. I'm just trying to figure out how this fits into sort of, are we unique in any one particular way? And so it's helpful to me to understand it. Thank you.
Good, good, good discussion. Okay, so here's a picture of what the 2010 restructuring did. If you look at this arrow, sorry, it flattened the payments from 2009 through 2014. Then you see the jump in 2015 that we talked about. And so that's kind of a little cliff out there that we can look at different ways of addressing. Okay. Okay, then in 2012, the district abated the entire 2012 levy for bond and interest. So you took $1,178,588, which you saw in your 2014 budget, coming out of the ed fund, going to the bond and interest fund to pay these bonds so the taxpayers don't have to. Okay? So that made your bond and interest tax rate go from 18 cents to 0. Now, if you don't do another abatement next year, it's going to pop back up to 20 cents. So not only do we have a cliff out there in 2015, we've got an immediate cliff in the 2013 levy because of the total abatement that was done in 2012. So let's go to the next slide. And here you can see exactly that. So here's our graph now with a 2012 abatement, 0. Up in 2013, unless we do additional abatements and those kind of things. Okay, So now this has got a lot of numbers on it, but I wanted to try to put this into context of the home. So we start on the right or the left side with the change in the EAV of existing EAV. So if you have a $750,000 home in 2008 and your home follows the rest of the district, 65, in terms of what changes happen with existing values, you went down 3.25% to 725, then down to 669, down to 624, down to 574 in 2012. So your $750,000 home is now being valued at $574,000 by the assessor. Okay? And if we go down another 2% in 2013, it brings it to 562,680, which we've just frozen for the rest of the time period. The next column is the estimated equalized assessed valuation of the home. So they take the market value, divide it by 3. So that's our EAV, and we're not talking about exemptions or any of that stuff. Next, we look at the district's total tax rate. This isn't your total tax bill, but it's the district's portion of your total tax bill. And back in 2008, it was 2.07, stayed steady in 2009, jumped up in 2010 because we had a decrease of 7.6% in the EAV. 2.5 in 2012, estimate, or 2.19 in 2012, and then the rest are estimates. But then look at the dollars on the tax bill, okay? And the increase or decrease. In 2009, taxes actually went down in this district. That was a year we had a 0.1% CPI, and I think the district didn't levy very much of that. So a very stable, slight decrease in the total taxes paid. Then in 2011, the district took the CPI, so it was up 109, took the CPI plus the debt in 2012, 74, and then here we are in 2012. This not only represents the reduction due to the debt service abatement, a full 20 cents down on the tax rate, but it also reflects the $3 million reduction in the operating tax levy that Jane was talking about before, which determines your dollars that you are applying here in the 2014 budget year. Okay? So taxpayers for the district's portion of the bill got a 20% reduction this year. If you levy the CPI, which is 1.7 this year, not very big, and levy for your debt as scheduled, your tax bill for the district's portion in 2013 will go up almost 11%. So you gave them a huge gift in 2012. If you don't think strategically about 2013, it's going to go up 11%. And that 11% increase that is shown on your projection is taken into consideration that you would take the CPI. It's only 1.7%. You've got deficits in those next 5 years. Okay, so we're saying you are going to take the CPI. So then we go to 2015. That's when the debt service pops back up. I split the tax bill into the operating portion. So here's the operating tax rate and the operating dollars, and the debt service tax rate and the debt service dollars. So you can see on the debt service side, the effect of that 2010 refunding ends in 2014, and in 2015, we're going to go from 20 cents to 33 cents. Okay, so that's $580 increase on the tax bill in 2015. So there's two kind of things coming up here as we look at your future projections with zero increase, of course, in the EAV. But I wanted to try to put it in terms of the home for you. Okay.
Those, Liz, those are annual increases, the debt service portion of the tax bill per homeowner?
Those
So each
aren't,
year,
these are not increases, these are dollars paid.
incremental.
For each year, what you're paying for debt for District 65 on your
Oh,
tax.
each year,
dollars
okay,
paid,
okay,
yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
gotcha.
It's these middle columns that shows the increase or decrease.
Okay.
Good question.
So,
Okay.
but if you look at the average of the last 2 years, right, the negative 19.77 and the positive 10.82, if you look at those 2 years as a whole, and I'm not saying all taxpayers do that, but we're really just about level. I'm not doing the math.
Negative
correctly.
9.
We're down 10%.
We're down a whole 10%. Okay. Not quite 10%, I guess,
Right.
9, yeah,
I'm rounding.
right.
Okay. Good point. Here's a picture of that chart for the $750 home. And you can see the red bars are the debt portion of the tax bill. The blue bars are your operating portion. So you can see how big they are compared to each other. The debt is obviously much smaller, but you can see here in 2012, not only is the debt missing, but we're down $3 million in our operating levy. Okay, and so then there's the 1.7 increase on the blue bar, and then the debt at the 20 cents, and so on and so forth.
We were down $3 million on the operating side, but your projected deficit is,
Not less than $1 million at the moment.
That's a projected surplus, isn't it? Yeah, it's not a
No,
deficit.
that's,
Next year.
I gotta go back.
They're working on the microphones, that's why we only have one tonight. No, at the moment, we're looking at just almost $1 million deficit in total for next year.
So even though we went down $3 million, we're still accumulated an extra $1 million? Is that what
Correct.
you're telling me?
Correct.
Right.
But that's
To meet
because
sur-
the 2011 tax levy funded the 2013 fiscal year.
Okay, so so you didn't answer, the question I
You got it
meant
right.
is that so you're projecting if I read this correctly, so you're projecting there'll be a $140,000 deficit based on the 3 million? That's what I see, right?
what are you
No,
looking at?
in total,
Well, I'm
in total,
correlating.
the total deficit for next year, which is, the deficit means those dollars spending more than revenues. It doesn't talk about surpluses, just dollar in, dollar out. We're gonna have a shortfall right now of just about $1 million.
So where is that in your
Spending $1 million
numbers?
less than we've taken.
Spending $1 million more than
more
we're
than we
taking
took
in,
in.
correct.
But where is that in your numbers?
In the budget summary.
Because I'm looking at the
She's looking
PMA.
at the
Oh, she's looking at
projections.
PMAs. I've got next year's preliminary budget, that's what I'm referring to.
Okay,
Actual
wait,
budget for next year.
So those are,
So where is it built in the projections?
Is that the 2014 number? Is that, you're talking about the 2014 number?
well, I'm looking at the
These are-
2014 numbers, and it says that,
I gotta like- I
and
wanna
I'm
get to the
assuming, this is why I cannot, I'm having a hard time here.
Yeah. It's the aggregate page, Christine, which is about 3 pages from the back.
What's the number?
Page
Do you have a
16
number?
of our printout.
That's $1 million surplus, right? Under 2013, it's a
For
$1 million.
fiscal year 2014 is what we're talking about.
That's a $2 million deficit.
16,
But that includes
assuming this is the
abatement.
same numbering as that.
So without including abatement, we're looking, on the
Okay.
PMA's projections are 800,000.
Okay.
Right now, we're up to 900,000 plus deficit
Okay.
in total operating fund budget next year.
So getting back to Christine's,
Her point is, we cut $3 million out of the levy, but we're only have $1 million shortfall,
Right.
I believe is what you're trying to
Right.
point out.
Yes.
Yes.
okay.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, abatement, just to give you the definition, it's when you use your operating funds to pay the debt service instead of the debt service or bond and interest tax levy. So you direct the county clerk to reduce or abate that bond and interest tax levy. And that's what you did here in 2012, okay? So here's that preliminary 2014 budget again, and here it is fund by fund, okay? So I think this is what Jane and Christine were just talking about. Of that operating fund balance, from revenues versus expenditures across these operating funds, we have just under $1 million deficit. Then add the abatement, we got another 1.1 million for approximately a 2.2 million drawdown across funds for your budget year FY14. The reason I put this chart in here is because in some of the abatement options I'm going to look at next, we want to be mindful of what that transfer from the ed to the debt service fund, like we did this year, that 1.1 million 7, what's that going to do to our fund balance in the future? Okay, so that's why I have this slide here. All right, so our first abatement option, and this includes the one you did in 2012, the 1.17, is say, you know, our fund balances at 91%, you saw that 91% of annual expenditures, we feel they're still too high. So what we're going to do is abate debt service for the next 4 years in total, okay? So you can see we're keeping that debt service levy that of 0 in 2012 for the next 4 years. In total, that would have been 7.5 million in operating funds that we're using to pay debt. That's the abatement. Now, what does that do for that taxpayer, the $750,000 home? Well, if we didn't do the abatement, they'd be paying 20 cents. A 20-cent reduction on that $750,000 home is about $500 a year. Okay, so that's the benefit to the taxpayer, the owner of a $750,000 home in this option. So this looks good, but again, we got another cliff out here where the debt then pops back up. And we've used $7.5 million of our funds to make those abatements. Thanks, Jane. So then we want to say, well, if we do all that, what is the impact on our fund balances? Now, on these projections of the operating fund balance, I started from Jane's preliminary 2014 budget and assumed, it was a big assumption, that for future years you're going to match your revenues to your expenditures. So for example, CPI gives you a 1.7% increase in your next 2013 levy. That means your expenses are going to not go up more than 1.7%, so you're balanced. So the only drawdown on fund balance in this example are these abatements. So we've got 2013 abatement, 14, 15, 16, totaling that 7.5 million. It takes our fund balance as a percent of expenditures from 92% down to 46%.
I hope I didn't miss it, and if I just missed it, don't restate it. How did you come up with the schedule of abatement, to the amount each year, if we hadn't already talked about it?
I just brought your, say, abate the total debt service just like you did last year.
Okay.
Down to zero.
Down to
Pay
zero.
it all from operating.
Oh, okay, so, okay.
Just
Sorry.
said, you know, we
Thank
did
you.
it last year, let's keep doing it so the taxes don't jump up 20 cents. And just so you know, there are thousands of ways to splice and dice all these options. I'm just kind of giving you a framework to think about.
Yeah, the downside here again is the cliff, the bump.
The downside is the cliff.
So people are not going to be happy with this option.
The other downside is going to be, gosh, what if we have some deficits? Your PMA projection showed you'd have some deficits in the next 5 years. Instead of 46%, our fund balance might be down to 35% if we end up spending more than we take in. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Okay? This next option is another abatement scenario, and I call this abatement with a soft landing. And the idea is not to have that cliff where we go from 0 up to 37 cents, but we abate in such a way that we're adding back some of that debt service levy each year. So in 2013, we let 288,000 of the 1.18 million debt service levy go back on the tax rolls. It's a 5-cent increase. Add another 5 cents the next year, so we go 5, 10, 15, 20, 21. We still have a little cliff here, but it's not nearly as bad as going from 0 to 39 cents. And it's still a savings to the taxpayers what they would otherwise have paid based on the original, on the current schedule.
So,
Okay.
just a quick question. In 2018, the revised debt service tax rate almost doubles, 0.21 to 0.39, right?
Yeah.
Okay, does that mean that the savings go from 403 to a net zero?
Right.
Okay. And that should hold then from there on out, more or less?
More or less.
Okay.
So you can see how the economy's doing then, if you've got the Stone Bridge coming on and, EAV's going up and kind of numbing any tax rate increases. Maybe you say, okay, let's just let it roll on and we're done. If you're not in that situation, then we look at other options, either more abatements or refundings. In this scenario, though, we're abating a lot less. We're abating $5.5 million instead of $7.5 million in the prior scenario. So let's go to the next slide and see what that does to fund balance. Instead of at 46% after all those abatements, we're at 57%. So that's a little better cushion, maybe a little more affordable. Okay, next I'm going to turn to refunding options. And the following options look at refunding and stretching out debt service. Okay, so it's similar to what we did in 2010. These are not refunding for savings, but they're refunding to make your annual payments more level, going from a 15-year mortgage to a 30-year mortgage. In our case, we can't go 30 years. We can only go 20. But it's the same idea, stretching out. Okay, so option one is similar to the 2010. We just, in 2015, remember that's our cliff, 2015, we're going to refund to keep the debt at that 1.2 million level for 5 years. So we're, again, got another cliff, that's a negative, but that's something you could do for 5 years. See how we're doing after that. Option two builds on option one, refunding bonds every 5 years to level the debt service payments and therefore the tax.
Option 1B or option 2?
She's calling it option 2.
You know what? I maybe did it differently.
Okay.
I think
Yeah,
you're
later
right.
it's
I think it's
referred
option 1B. Sorry
Okay.
about that.
That's right.
Right.
Sorry
And-
to interrupt.
Nope, thank you for correcting me. And then the next option refunds all the bonds, and right here in 2015 refunds all the bonds for 20-year maximum, resulting in completely level debt service at 1.9 million. It's going to make much more sense when you see the charts and graphs on this. And then the last option uses the debt service abatements in the option 2 soft landing that we just reviewed, and then refunds in 2018 to flatten the debt. So these are mostly refunding options, and then the last one is a combination of abatement and refunding. Just one thing I want to add, when you do these refundings, if you don't do the abatements, you can reduce the cost of the refunding by using some of your fund balance to deposit to that
Toward
refunding.
the principal.
Right.
So you actually have, instead of having the original amount, you're way below.
Right,
Pardon?
you're
What was that?
offsetting your cost by cash.
What was that? I didn't hear
In
you.
other words, you would use, it'd be like a refi on a house. Let's say you owe
Yeah.
200 grand on a house, and you decide, okay, I'm going to extend the loan, but I'm going to put 50 grand down.
Okay.
Correct?
Yeah.
So not only you're going to reduce the monthly payment because you're extending it, but also because the principal is less.
Exactly.
I have a question. On some of these ongoing refunding options where we refund every 5 years, are we're not committing to that ongoing refunding schedule from the very beginning, are we? I mean, we can
That is a
evaluate-
really good point.
Because we want to be able to evaluate the interest alternatives I would think we would periodically.
Exactly. You'd want to look at the interest market, you'd want to look at the economy and how the EAV is doing, but most importantly, not clear that all of you will be sitting in these seats 5 years from now. Okay, so you have a little bit of
15 years from now.
political risk. I know you're all going to be lifers, right?
No.
So that's a little bit of a risk. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's a good
this
point.
I would not do this.
All right, so
This is not.
I think you get to it later in the deck, but waiting till 2018 to do any refunding, of course, is betting that the interest rates will either stay low or cycle up and then cycle back down, right?
That's a really good point. In all these scenarios, we've used today's interest rates because we just don't know when. We know they're going up. We don't know how much. We don't know when. So all these options use current market.
What is the relationship between interest rates and EAV?
You know,
I'm sure you've done some studies on those.
You know, that's a really good question, and it really has to do with the housing market relationship to interest rates. So, you know, but we're kind of in the housing crisis, as you will, because we had low interest rates and easy credit combinations for so long caused the crash, right? So low interest rates typically stimulate the housing market and increases in borrowing and EAV. But we've got this overlying problem of, you know,
Too much
the Great
leverage.
Recession, too much leverage, too much easy credit, which has caused the terrible default rates, the tightening of credit to get loans, even though rates are low. So we're really, in my mind, in an uncharted territory. But in the typical world, low interest rates stimulate EAV through housing, both commercial and residential. Okay, so option 1A, we're going to 2015, and we are changing the debt service, which would have been 1.9 million, bringing it back down to 1.2 million. Notice I don't have any abatements in 2013 and 14, so we're back up to the $1.2 million debt service level. So there, you know, it's going to feel like an increase, even though it's not. It's just not an abatement. But of course,
Wait.
see, we did the abatement in 2012 for the $500 savings to the home. And in 2013 and 14, I'm saying our debt is not going to be any different from what it was originally scheduled to be.
Okay, good,
But it's going to feel like an increase. So, but this structure takes 5 years out and stabilizes the debt payments at 1.2 million, okay? So versus what they would have paid in the 2 million, 2.3, 2.4 million range, it's savings to the taxpayer. Now, stretching out debt, we're putting the debt out at the end of the schedule, and you know, we went out another 6 years. We could shorten this and make it less costly, but this net cost scenario is 3.2 million. Going out the 20 years, or out to 2033 levy year. Okay. So here's a graph. We stabilize the debt another 5 years out to 2019. We've got a cliff. And then here's the repayment of the bonds we refunded out there. So the advantage is that we've got another 5 years of low payments at 1.2 million. We need to refund again after 5 years. I see that as a plus and a minus, because we're not refunding the whole thing at once, which is even more costly. We're just refunding 5 years and going to see what the financial condition of the district is in 5 years, if you can afford some abatements, if you need to refund again out there. The negative is that you still have a cliff out here. I mean, there's no doubt. And the interest cost of stretching out debt is a factor in all these scenarios. In this case, 3.2 million.
What would happen if you backed into this and assumed that you didn't want any savings? So the savings of 325, 364 would be zero. How would that affect the amount that you abate?
Can you go back, Jane, one slide?
So in other words,
So you're saying if there's no savings, then there's no refunding. Okay? It would just be, see, because the savings we're comparing to what you would have paid if you do nothing. Okay? Versus you do this restructuring. And you can see we got $94 out here. That's the interest cost of that additional debt. So by doing that refunding, you're adding additional debt. If you use some of your own cash, that number goes down. But
And the refunding you're assuming comes from reissued bonds?
new bonds.
And what's your assumption on interest for those?
In this scenario, it's 3.66%.
Okay.
Okay, let's go to the next one. Option B is if we do the 5-year refunding again and again, every 5 years, okay? So here's our first refunding, which we saw on the prior page, same net cost. Then in 2020, we do it again for another 5 years, stretch it out. And then we do the last 3 years in 2025, stretching it out. So each of these refundings at today's interest rates costs between 2.8 and 3.4 million. However, do note, with doing these every 5 years and trying to flatten this debt service as much as possible, we're out to 2041. Okay?
So the rating agency are not gonna like that.
No. They don't like that.
Right, so would that mean that they would downgrade us?
Depends on other factors going on in the district.
So if you were you would not go that way? Come on.
Putting words in my mouth.
She is her, she's her, never mind. If you were, I mean, okay, if it was your coin, would you choose that option? This is what I'm asking.
You know, it depends on how important these annual payments are to the district and how the economy's doing. If we're in a zero growth, like disastrous mode for the next 25 years, each 5 years, I might consider doing something like this.
But that's the key right there. Each 5 years, you
You can
evaluate.
think about it. Yeah.
Well,
So
yeah, but
does that-
look at the cost of doing a refi every 5 years. I mean, this is a hell of a burden.
$10
You know what I'm
million.
saying? I mean, so
There is a cost to that every
there
5
is
years.
there's a, you know, there's no freebie. So yes, you're evaluating, but, and then you're assuming that when the 5 year is up, interest rate is perfectly aligned, and that you're not gonna take a hit. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Right.
Two questions. The first, option 1A, for 1 5-year refunding, is that also viewed negatively by the rating agencies?
Whenever you stretch out debt, it's not a credit positive.
Okay.
How's that? I mean, the thing is, debt is 10 to 15% factor in the overall rating of the district. And it will not be positive in any stretch out scenario. But it's not going to be, being only 10 to 15% of the rating, it's not going to deep six you unless you've got other bad things happening like deficit spending.
So this, compared to the first scenario where we had 3.2 million in net incremental cost, here we're going to incur 8 million?
Yeah, 9 million. If we
9
go to the
million,
next
okay.
page. So the beauty of this is, wow, we have really flat debt service. It climbs a little bit every 5 years, but it's pretty flat compared to where it was in this scenario, down, you know, under 35 cents versus before it went up over 50 cents on the tax rate. But the interest cost of stretching out that debt, based on today's interest rates, is $9.4 million for all three of those issues. And we've got the debt service stretched out to 2041. That's far. That's why the interest cost is high. And you have future interest rate risk. So I think this really levels things, but I think it's an expensive option.
But it does, I mean, it benefits current taxpayers at the expense, of course, of future taxpayers who, as I said earlier, share in the expense of building this 50-year building we have. So, I mean, I know it's a huge debt, and from a personal perspective, none of us want to carry debt, but this isn't personal debt. We have to view this somewhat differently, I think. Now, the 9.4 million is a little high, but nevertheless, it's being shared.
It's being shared. The other thing you got to think about is, what if we get out in 2028 and we need to build an addition because now we got more kids?
Right.
That's the problem. You really lock yourself because you limit your option as far as, you know, assuming that the birth rate suddenly increased dramatically. Now you have still plenty of debt to pay, and you need something new.
Well, and even if enrollment stays static for the next, you know,
What'd
50.
you say? I didn't hear you.
Even if enrollment stays static for the next 50 years, your middle school is aging. At some point in
Right.
time down here, that is going to be your big question.
You know, we killed this one, right?
It'll be over 100 years old by
Yeah.
this time.
Yeah, yeah.
So will we.
And still on the board.
For yourself.
And still a board member.
Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay,
School down there.
this next option levels the debt service in 2015. Remember the 2015 cliff where it went from 21 cents up to 39 or almost 40? So we refund bonds, issue new bonds. There is a cost, 3.4 million, but our debt is totally level at 1.9 million. We're going out in this case to 2033, so not that much farther. We're going out 6 years farther than the current expiration of the debt service. So it has a cost. It gets the job done all at once in this interest rate environment. It's not as low as a 1.2 million a year, but it's, 1.9 million a year.
Yeah.
And there's no abatement here, this is just simply refund.
Simply refund.
Okay.
It'd be interesting to be a combination of abatement and
That's the
and
next
refund.
that's the next
Yes.
option.
Yep. So let's go to the next slide to see how that looks graphically. We still have an increase from 2014 to 2015. You could always use some cash to make this more of a soft transition, if you will, but it's level for the life of the bonds. Annual payments, 1.9 million. If you have to go build a new school out here, it's going to go on top of that. But you're not going to be facing the steep cliff like you are currently.
And again, we're using this 0% growth on the EAV. So we assume we do see some growth on the EAV eventually, then
may
that'll
go
start
down.
to go down a little
Right,
bit
right.
in relation to.
This is
any
worst
growth.
case.
Yeah, yes, I would like to think
Most
that, yes.
conservative.
Right.
Yes, but which is good, but you would hope that at some point in time it will start
Right.
to come
You know,
down.
what's interesting is the date. I mean, if Stonebridge comes into play, and I don't like to count the, kill the bear with, you know what I'm trying to say, right? There's two things. There is the increase in EAV because of new construction, and then there's also the impact fees. The Naperville ordinance. So based on size of houses, X amount of dollars will go to the school system. And it's, the estimates right now are around 800 grand, which would be something that you could actually, depending on how the impact fees are collected, put toward this to,
Offset it.
yes.
If it's truly an impact fee, can we use it towards that, or we can only use it for construction?
If it affects the debt on the school where the house that's paying the fee is. So if your kids go K to 8, they go through both schools, so I think you're fine. You're fine.
But if you get an impact fee, it's because there's also going to be an impact, right? So do you know?
That's too logical.
Well, how many students are attached to that? Do we know?
Maximum 58.
Okay.
We have
I
plenty
just
of room
had
for
that
that.
conversation, so,
Well,
and I was
maybe.
given some projections about this.
Well, the number we were given when Jim and I met with them.
Okay.
Yeah, so 2016, 26, 2017, 47, 2018, 58, and it stabilized this. Because eventually, that said, the whole development is full, and then eventually people grow, so they're not using this one,
Right.
which is a pretty conservative estimate.
Now,
How many guys are coming from Tangley Oaks, do you know right now?
Kids?
Yes.
How many students from Tangley Oaks?
40-something?
We don't know that. I don't know that.
That would be an interesting comp, you know what I'm saying?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay.
It is interesting.
Although Tangley Oaks is a very changing neighborhood. It's
Which is what we're going
I'm
to be
sure they would
talking
not like
about.
to hear that, but,
It's also, it's already, wait until you see
Yeah,
our
but this
kindergarten
is,
numbers.
Stonebridge has units in there that are not conducive to family. I mean, there's that pocket neighborhood, these are smaller houses, they're not kids oriented. I mean, this is not a product that you would buy with kids. There's not like 4-bedroom, there's like 2 bedrooms type of.
Now, where's the impact of inflation in this model here? If I understood what we were saying before, you'd actually want to see increasing payments for
Well,
debt service.
that's an idea.
Right.
I just flatten this
Okay.
for a no-growth scenario. If you did an increasing scenario by something CPI-like, 2%, you'd still have a cliff, but, it's a philosophy of keeping the payments lower here and spreading them out when there's more people, hopefully, to absorb them. If you really feel you're in a no-growth situation, level debt service is your best bet. So it's a philosophy,
Okay.
Okay, option 3. This combines that soft landing with the abatements, and then we go to 2018 to refund level debt service for the life of the bonds. So here's our less abatements that kind of gives us that soft landing. So we are still saving money versus what we would have paid, but we're phasing in the debt at 5 cents a year up through 2018. Then we're going to refund bonds to try to flatten the payments at 1.5 million in this case. We are going out 10 years to 2037. Of course, this refunding happens in 2018, so we don't know what the rates are going to be, but if it was done today, it'd be 3.5% and a 3.4 million cost.
Good enough with that.
So this
If
is a
we-
combination of the soft landing abatement and then level debt
You
service
could
after
do
that.
this then with the 2015 refund though, right?
You could do it
Combine the
earlier.
2015 refund, because it seems like the interest rates are not going anywhere good.
The other thing about these abatements is they're really annual decisions. So there's a
Right.
And the
lot of
amount-
things happening in the state,
Yeah, the amount you abate here, it's simply the difference in between revenue and expenditures, right? That's the surplus.
Well, it's whatever
So
you
we can pick-
decide that you're going to take out of your operating funds and apply to debt service to reduce the tax rate.
And if-
Now, if we get the cost shift from the pensions and it's all in 1 year as opposed to being phased in, you may not want to do some of those larger abatements
Right.
based on, your levy and stuff. So I just want to make the point that they're annual decisions that you can pull back or add to depending on how you're doing financially and what the situation is.
And the amount we elect to abate is completely up to what we have in reserve and what we think we're going to need our reserves for in the future.
Exactly.
And if we do abate more in the beginning years, of course, this curve sinks a little bit.
Well, if you abate more in the beginning years, you're sort of creating a cliff too, remember, because the bigger the abatements, the lower the debt service now, which is great. But as you know, our original debt service is increasing. So that's going to mean a cliff at some point.
It's limits for us also financially in the district.
Right.
And this is total debt cost is net cost is 3.4 million.
Right.
Okay.
Assuming today's interest rates.
Correct.
No,
Okay.
3.56 interest rates.
Yeah.
Which is
Today's interest rate.
Which is today's.
Yeah,
And
as if we were issuing today.
Right.
Mhm.
Which is the other.
But the EAV, if the interest rates go up theoretically, the EAV should go up, as Rich pointed out earlier, hopefully to match that, or maybe even be better than that to offset any difference.
So if the
And then we'll come in,
EAVs are
then
going up,
inflation would go up
people are
too.
not gonna be so
Right.
worried about what's going on with their taxes, I can tell you that.
And
Right.
this is the limit, the 20-year limit that we talked about earlier, going out 2037.
Yeah.
And someone said earlier that rating agencies don't look, they look negatively at this sort of stretching out of the debt process. even-
Correct.
impacts the ratings.
But then you said that was maybe 15% of the decision. I think the
Right.
rating agency are gonna look at the neighborhood, the EAV, the increase in value, et cetera, et cetera.
Your budget.
Home
deficit
values,
spending.
deficit spending is a real big one. Fund balance
This is
policy.
almost like a mortgage, you know, you have a degree of security, you know what your payment's gonna be year to year, more or less. You're stretching it out so that we all share the wealth here with future users, let's say. So we're not impacting the current users necessarily haphazardly. So from my perspective, this approach seemed to be more acceptable simply because of those factors, those reasons.
Although the use of the term mortgage scares me because it implies that you could pay it off early if you wanted to, and there's schedules here that restrict that.
Yeah,
Well, the
But I
schedule's
mean,
going to
there's a-
restrict that, but where are you going to come up with $20 million to
Right,
pay
right.
it
No,
off
but
early
there's
anyway?
been, I'm
Mark has-
referring to
Mark has it.
conversations we've had in the past where people were confused perhaps with the interaction, the analogy to some of these things, comparing it to a mortgage, where why don't we use some of our surplus just to pay it down? And
Gotcha.
you can't always just do that.
That's absolutely correct. We're going to do that now. We have to put it in an escrow, so.
And you said earlier, I just want to go through this again. If we decide, let's say today, to go out because interest rates are as low as they are and find a smaller bond issue, let's say, to utilize as an abatement, I'll just say, or defease, I guess it's not defeasable. Maybe it is a defeasement, but if we.
Use your cash to pay down.
From a lower,
bonds.
right, from a lower bond issue. So
To
you-
make the bondage size lower because you're going to fund the part of the refunding with cash.
Yes.
Like Christine's example.
Yeah, that's a possibility as well, correct?
Yes, yes. So you can either use your cash for abatements, or you can use it as part of the deposit that goes in the escrow to repay these bonds, and that would make this stream of payments lower because our bond size is less, and this net cost would be lower.
Does that make sense to do?
Well, it depends how you want to use your money, you know, and it depends what shape you want your debt to look like. I think some of your good points you raised tonight about philosophy, you know, about pay now, pay later. Do you want some increase in that schedule that would shorten the life, or do you want it as flat as possible and as long as possible? I think those conversations will drive the shape of the debt that you want for the future, and then we can come back with the most efficient way to get there. And then, of course, what falls into all this is what you want your fund balance to be. Right now, you have a minimum of 25%, I believe, in your policy, which is the state's policy, which, you know, and Mary Lee, of course, chime in on this. For a small district like yours, I think is a little bit low, because you can have one bad thing happen that's going to, you know, hit you hard with 25% in the bank. Most school districts your size, we see at least, have more of a 50% fund balance. So making that decision about, you know, how low you want to go tells us how much cash you have to dedicate to either abatements or defeasance in conjunction with a refunding bond issue. And then the next question is, of course, what is the shape of the debt service that's tolerable for us as a community?
What if I wanted to present you with an outcome and asked you to solve for me, the equation for me? Let's assume I wanted to have no savings in this right-hand column, okay? Make it zero, all the way on down to the bottom. And I suggest that you use either refinancing new issues plus abatement plus refinancing existing issues. How would you go about doing that? I mean, you may not be able to answer that question right now, but
Well, let me just put it to you this way. Let's just look at this scenario. This net cost, this $3.4 million, is simply the difference between the principal and interest that we're refunding and the new principal and interest we're issuing to take out this piece. This $3.4 million does not count the $5.5 million that we've already abated in the soft landing scenario. So, you know, if you're looking at your cash as a contribution towards the cost of this whole scenario, you are, you know, net positive in terms of savings to the taxpayers right here. You've taken $5.5 million of your fund balance and paid it back to the taxpayers through abatements. That's offset by this cost of $3.4 million. So you can see, I'm just kind of trying to go towards your thought process and your equation that you put out there. Even in this type of scenario, we're net positive. We could adjust these numbers so it zeroes out, if that is what you're asking.
Well, I'm just trying to find best case, which is probably impossible in this scenario, but, thinking about low interest rates today, I mean, they're not going to get any lower, obviously, and thinking about whether the option of refinancing through, using a smaller bond issue, let's say, as part of our cash payment, if we don't want to use our reserve, does that make sense given the low interest rate climate today? And if we do that, the savings each year, I would be happy. I'm a taxpayer, obviously. I don't necessarily, I'm happy with what we did last year, and I just don't want to see the taxes go up, but I don't necessarily need to see my taxes go back down again. I'm perfectly happy contributing what I do now to the school district. So to keep that zero, if there's a way to back into that in a sensible fashion, I would be interested in seeing that scenario. That's what I was trying to suggest.
Okay, I mean, we absolutely can do it, but the parameters we need is how low are you willing to go in your fund balances?
Right.
Let's combine the reasonable projections that PMA is doing for the next 5 years and be comfortable.
Going back to the comment you made about the reserve, in a small school district, the reserve being 50%, and you say if something happened, what could happen? I mean, give me a what-if scenario. I mean, because since 97% of your revenue comes from EAV, it's not like you are, let's say, Libertyville, where you're getting all those auto sales tax to fund the operations of the village. You see what I'm saying? So
No,
give
you're
me an
right. The
example.
property tax is the most stable revenue source. But I'm thinking more on the expense side. If you have a tornado come through, I mean, hopefully insurance would cover some of that. But, or if you have,
Well, my question,
God forbid, I don't even want to say it, but a mold problem like St. Charles or something, asbestos or some, I'm thinking facility, that would cause you to be. Right.
Some of the
My-
unique things that can happen in the school district.
my question though on, as far as a fund balance is, you're suggesting 50%. Well, this community, if there's a problem, you don't have trouble going back to this community and saying, we've got a problem, we've got to get this fixed. This is a highly educated community, and they recognize how important the schools are. Now, I can understand if you're in, southern Illinois and trying to go back to taxpayers for a disaster, it's very hard. But in an affluent community, which we happen to be in, I'm not suggesting that we go beat the taxpayers up, but I don't know that there's a rationale for keeping the fund as high as we have it.
Well, it seems to me, isn't this what strategic planning is going to take care of?
Right.
We're going to come up with our objectives and our principles and what we think are reasonable assumptions about the future of this community, and then we set all that forth, and we turn it over to the experts who figure out what outcome that leads to, what option is best, right?
Just the timing on this, all this.
That's what I'm figuring.
What do we need to think about in terms of timing if we want to start the process of either abating and restructuring?
Well, the 2013 levy is key.
Right, and that's a December deadline, right? So you have to do it in November.
November?
And that will coincide with the strategic planning, which we can
Or
actually.
could we put the finance piece of the strategic?
We can, the only problem is there are some intersections.
Yep.
Such as curriculum that what might tie into facilities, et cetera.
I mean, the question I have, Susan, you made a point earlier about bigger districts having more schools, and so you don't feel this fluctuation as much. You hear about places kind of managing it so that as one debt is paid off, you're starting the next one. So if we had 15 schools, you'd kind of always be paying off a school, and there wouldn't be that concern. It looks like we have a lot of cash right now, and we just replaced a school, but the middle school is over 50 years old. So to me, before we can have a meaningful conversation about this, we need to know where we're headed with that building.
What's the future of the middle school?
And that's where we've been under some pressure to get the strategic plan moving ahead. Because in order to have these answers about where our facilities are going long-term, before we do this levy discussion that leads up to this, we need to keep the ball rolling.
No question.
Yeah.
Neil has something to say. Can Neil talk?
Yeah, but he needs the mic.
Well, yeah, sure. We would love to hear from you. We have a section at the end, we were going to have a section at the end of the meeting where people
Lame
address.
duck now.
I hope so.
Just do it. Just do it now. It's-
Yeah, go ahead.
The
Non-percent sign.
question I'm hearing is, over and over, is how much money should we have in reserves? Well, I had a short meeting with Jane a few days ago, and I gave her a copy of a reserve study. I use reserve studies in my business to help us determine how much money we should be setting aside to maintain facilities, including things like replacing the roof, replacing the windows, replacing the air conditioner. You know that they're going to wear out, and the roof is going to last between 15 and 20 years. The air conditioners are going to last between 10 and 15 years. So the question is, how much money should you be setting aside today to take care of these things in the future? Now, I'm not in favor of using a percentage as a fund balance, because that, in effect, if you say you should have 50% of the fund balance, since the majority of the fund balance of the annual expenses is salaries, in effect what you're saying is that the cost of replacing a roof is directly related to the salaries that you pay. They're not. There's no relationship whatsoever. If an engineer were to come in here and do a study, he would produce a chart. And you didn't have, Jane has a sample copy of what one of these look like. And they produce a chart that says you will need X money in so many years, X money in so many more years, X money in so many more years. You take the idea with this is that you take the amount of, you can equate this backwards to say, here's how much money we need today, and we need to add a certain amount to it each year to make sure that we have enough money to replace the roof. You know, on one of our school buildings, the roof might have to be replaced next year. On a new building, you got to think it's going to be another 12 to 15 years before that roof has to be replaced. Well, if a study like that were done, theoretically, let's say the numbers on here from PMA said that we've got approximately $14 million in reserves. Let's say hypothetically the reserve study comes back and says we don't need that much. Well, it seems like, to add another complication to all the good work that you've done, the difference between those two numbers could be used to pay down the bonds if that money is truly not necessary at this point. Then if you back up to one of your charts, where we're currently paying just interest today, and if you did level debt service, it would bump up to almost $2 million. Well, if you pay off a significant portion of the bonds, maybe that figure is going to be $1.5 million or $1.6 million or something like that instead of the $2 million. So that's another option that I might recommend that you consider is to think about getting a reserve study done so you know how much money you really need in reserves instead of guessing at a percentage, because the percentage has nothing to do with why you're collecting reserves.
I think.
Thanks.
I think what I hear, timeline-wise, I will review with Gina from ECRA, but I'm hoping we can coincide, because the reserve study, and I looked at it too, it looked very beneficial. We would need to add to that programmatic changes that we might want in a building. Again, a STEM lab, I'm just gonna throw that in. We might have to make, STEM is science and math. Science and math, it's the new lingo for education.
One that I will surely butcher.
Well, it's actually a federal acronym because that's a federal initiative. But if we were to do that, it's not just the reserve study for our buildings, it's also programmatic. Mm-hmm. So I know she had mentioned 3 months, and that that was the maximum, and that she would actually try to facilitate the 4 groups on a big day study And if she can do that properly and we can get things back to the board, we may have enough information to bring you back in. And I think what I'm gonna need, and help me with this, is I think that we need to go through the philosophies that you talked about. Do you want to extend it? If so, for how long? Much of the reserves do you want to use? Do you want a combination, et cetera? And I think the reserve piece, that's something the board will have to decide on. Maybe you want to decide on a reserve percentage, or maybe you want to decide on something associated with the strategic plan to pay off the
Right, because
improvements.
what Neil called a reserve, for me, is like a capital plan,
Mm-hmm.
where you would actually, every year, have a line item where you would say, okay, let's say we have that lab, but, lab equipment needs to be replaced on a regular basis, so how much do we allocate every year? So we have a fund, so when we're, ready to upgrade the lab, then the money is there. It's been accrued every year.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that. The reserve for me is more of, uncertainty in the economy, precipitous drop in the EAV, which, and so that percentage may be entirely different based on that.
You may want to do both, have some combination.
And probably I would do both, because I think that right now, what we're doing is that we have that fudge factor, and that fudge factor is what got us into, that huge reserve that we're having right now.
We're making up for lack of data with a big number by having a big reserve.
Well, yeah.
So I think the answer would be to try to find out where we are. The budget's adopted mid-September, and I think that we try to move the conversation immediately after the budget is ready to go. We start having this conversation, so we have plenty of time to talk about it and really intertwine it with the strategic planning
It
conversations.
keeps coming back to the strategic plan. I mean, everything
Right.
we're talking about, because we have to have all these other ancillary pieces put together to make all these decisions, so.
You know what strikes me about option 2 and 3, I think it is there doesn't seem to be a happy medium between a completely level number, 0.26 all the way out, and something that's a slight curve. We either see like this in or completely flat. And it seems to me that something that was, a slight curve, so that we reach maybe 0.40 as the high, or something like that, over that same course of time, would be more ideal. Is there a reason
Sure.
why it can't be
And
like
the
that?
reason I've kind of tried to aim for flat
Yeah.
is because we're being very conservative with any
The
growth.
EAV,
So,
right.
but you're absolutely right. We can look at those different options. Right now, your curve is going up, 3 to 5% a year, your
Yeah.
current curve. So if you want to do something less than that, 1%, 1.5%, 2%, we can run all those options. And what that does for you is it allows you to shorten the debt service up a little, save a little interest cost, but it does mean the payments are increasing if you need to do a new middle school out here. But if you pass a referendum for a new middle school, you can restructure some of that debt at the same time you issue that to make it all work together.
I mean, from a philosophy standpoint, do we operate lean, and then when we need the money, we go to referendum? Or do we decide, the referendum may be iffy, and we should set aside some funds? I don't know.
It's a different philosophy.
Right.
And that depends on the circumstance. I think the referendum would be more likely under one scenario versus another. So it's hard to project.
This has been very helpful, though. You've done a great job of laying it out in a way
Thank you
that's
for your
understandable.
patience. I know it's long, and there's a lot of new concepts here, so thank you.
It really was fantastic. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you.
I think what I've seen is that we need kind of a long-range plan, but have annual flexibility in it.
Right.
Well, it needs to be reevaluated regularly, yeah.
Any other questions? So it sounds like we're gonna get through the budget, and we'll see if there's any immediate questions. Funnel them through me, we'll get them to Liz, Jane, and I, and we can get you immediate answers for that, because you may do some of your great thinking tonight when you can't sleep. So we can get questions, otherwise we have some philosophical questions to go through with this packet.
Everybody's okay with bond questions for now?
Are we done?
No,
No, we're not done.
we're not done,
The
unfortunately.
next piece is easy.
Kindergarten.
Item 5 on our agenda is a discussion about ELL staffing. Oh, good. I think Jean will take us through that.
Just gonna, and I wish I could have gotten this to you earlier, but today was the first day I had time to work on this with you, all of you. I have another report I'm gonna give you at the end, and if you have problems with insomnia tonight, you'll be able to read through that when you get home.
This is yours, this is the same as mine. Is it?
You have a nice little, I have extras if you don't
No,
have them.
no, I just wanted to make sure
Okay.
there wasn't two things circulating. Okay.
We have a couple different things, and I think I have come up with a different solution than what I had originally proposed, based on test scores. So I want to just give you some trend data. If you take a look at 08-09 totals versus 13-14s, and you look at what's happened in between, we are on a trend up, different from 11-12 and 12 and 13. Now, walking through the different columns, we have 3 full-day teachers for kindergarten. These kindergarteners, their parents pay a fee for full-day kindergarten, and they're here all day. It's around 2,500. Then we have, and in the past, we've had 4 full-time teachers, but our enrollment went down, and so there aren't any numbers in there for 10, 11, and forward because we eliminated that section. Then we've always had a half-day section. I want to point out in the 09-10 school year, we had 25 in a classroom, and there was some controversy that year, and I guess a teacher aide was added to that section with 25 students. Then the economic crisis happened a little bit, which brings us down to the 12-13 school year. I want to make a note, under the 14, there's 3 asterisks. What happened with this half-day teacher prior to my arrival was there was a half-time kindergarten teacher who then had the other half of her day available. And they brought in the response to intervention model, which again is helping at-risk students. And they had this half-time kindergarten teacher work with at-risk kindergarten students in the afternoon. So even though it was only 1 half-day section, it was a full-time position. Does everybody understand that? Okay, so now we move into this year. We have 3 full-day sections. I've capped them at 19. In original discussions, and I've lost track of the months, we had a class size discussion with the union and the board at one point, and 19 is about the highest we could go, and still, these parents are paying a fee for the class, so it's capped. We have, I believe, 5 of the students in this 23 section for half-day that really are on a waiting list and want to go full-time. 23 is high for a kindergarten section. And what I've done is, if you look down at the very bottom of the first sheet, trend data for students that enroll in kindergarten over the summer, just so you can see. We've had 14, 16, 4, and 9.
That's the additional we've got
Those are
in July and
additional
August,
in
or-
July and August. So,
5 to 10, somewhere, or maybe 10 on
or
average.
higher, because we're higher this year with students. So this is just preliminary data. So, and this is kind of the data I was looking at prior to really analyzing the ELL data and saying we might have to look for another kindergarten teacher.
And ELL means?
Yep, good point. English language learner. It's defined in the memo, though.
Because you really got a full class more of kids than if we got the 9 over the summer and add those to the 5 that are waiting to get in full
It's
day.
a full class.
That's a class.
It's full class. If you flip to the next page, there's another issue that impacts our kindergarten situation and staffing, and that's the number of ELL students entering kindergarten. So in our district, we currently have 33 second language students that require a spectrum of services. This spring, I commissioned an ELL study, which you're gonna get to bring home with you tonight, so you can take a read. The expert whose name was given by the Illinois Resource Center, which is a state organization, He came in and did interviews and looked at our test data, and one of his main recommendations was that he did not feel that a teacher 0.5 or 50% was really an adequate amount of time to service 33 second language students. That was one of his prime recommendations for the 33 that we've had kind of the past couple of years.
33 both schools.
33 for both schools. That's a district, and she is supposed to service both schools. And mind you, 33 was last year and the year before. We're going to talk about the incoming kindergartners in that. He talked about the inability to service students at both schools for that and provide the level of service needed with a 50% teacher. Okay, in providing preliminary home language survey testing, which is something most districts do and we have now started. Before kindergartners come to school, we test them to determine our staffing and make sure we have enough support. We have 11 students entering kindergarten, in addition to the 33 students we already have. Plus, we have 3 other students that are coming from Mexico, Miami, and Russia that still need to be tested. Just so you know, test score-wise, a test score of 5 or above is an exit number, and these kids, 10 of them were all at 1s and 1.5. So their language ability is very, very low. You also need to know, which will have an implication for us down in the future, we now then, currently at this moment, have 44 students. The NCLB subgroup is 45. So if we have one more register, we face different federal requirements for this subgroup of students. That has implications for grants and accountability on a federal basis now. So I'm going to recommend that we do the following, and we can vote on it in July, or if you feel good with the recommendation, I'll bring it to you next week. It's been a long night, so you're going to want to kind of sort through. We currently have these 3 full-time kindergarten teachers, and this full-time teacher that was really only teaching 0.5. My recommendation is that we eliminate the 0.5 response to intervention and make that teacher a full-time kindergarten teacher, 2 half-day sections. That's at a no cost. What we're eliminating is the response to intervention for the high-risk students. However, our high-risk students in kindergarten are probably going to be second language. So tied into that, the second recommendation would be to increase our current ELL teacher to full-time. Due to the increased number of second language students in the district, as well as the volume of incoming student needs, our ELL teacher needs to be 100%. She needs to travel back and forth. We're going to have to figure out different things we need to do now to meet federal requirements. And it would allow her to service all of our students. So the cost is down at the bottom to make her full-time, which would also include her benefits.
Is that offset in any way by the fees that are paid?
No, because they're half-time students, which is free.
Okay.
And the other piece that I needed to share, just for some district thoughts, is that some of our full-time students are waivered students. And that, again, means that they've reached a certain level of poverty. And we may need to evaluate that down the road, because there is a cost to it for the district. So if you can see, there's an increased cost of $46,000 to hire Jen, our current teacher, full-time. I just was able to get the ELL test data, which is why this report was taken a little bit later. So, in summary, I think it would probably be a more judicious move to take a current kindergarten teacher that's half-time teacher, half-time RTI, make her 2 half-time sections, which will definitely decrease that 23 in incoming students. It will not allow for another full-day section. That's important to note. And then we increase our ELL support. On a national level, the number of second language students is growing across the nation. We are not any different than any other district. I think one of our main differences is we have a variety of languages that are going to be hard to support if need be, and I'll give you a good example. I can't even think of the word. It was a new language I'd never heard. It's a variety of Indian. If that student comes in and we need to evaluate for special ed down the road, we need to find a translator within the state of Illinois that can translate in that language by federal law. So there's a lot of implications for this, and I think that the other recommendations, which I'm gonna pass the report out, involve looking at our curriculum and making sure we have our curriculum in place for second language learners. But we really need to concentrate and make that position a full-time position. So I'm open for questions, comments.
Got a couple questions.
What about the possibility of having a half-time person, one at each school? That would save on the benefits cost, and then you would have support on-site, which would cut down on the travel time.
I have had that before. I think the disadvantage with that is that you have to coordinate between the two schools. Right now, our current teacher services kids that are in the same families at both schools. So it's like a duplication of efforts trying to have meetings with the parents. The teacher that we have now services the families, and they're coming in as families. The other piece to that is it's hard to find good ELL teachers that are only willing to work 50% of the time. So, and that's a good point, because it does cost us benefits. But I really think that at this point, it's something we have to do for consistency and really to provide that good support to our kids.
Let me ask you this, I mean, assuming down the road that, I mean, this was a blip, I mean, I'm not sure it is, but, you know, then we have this extra kindergarten, what do we do? I mean, can we do a RIF or?
Extra
a
kindergarten?
reduction in force? I mean, if we don't have the number of students, I mean.
That's a very good question. If we don't have the number of students, I'm gonna gamble, and I don't do that very often. I'm hearing more and more homes are selling here, and new families are moving in. Now, I don't know if that's factual or not, but in answer to your question, Chris, yes, we would have to RIF. And that goes with the staffing plan.
Okay, so that goes back to the staffing plan?
Yes.
Okay, that's where I was going. Okay, I'm cool.
If we make the ELL teacher full-time, does that help us with that one change? Do we meet the needs of that NCLB requirements that you said, a new subgrouping requirements?
At this
Will
particular
that person be able to
point,
handle that?
at this particular point, she will be working, I have a lot of experience in ELL, as well as Barb West, who's the new interim principal. She also has a lot of experience. But I'm gonna tell you another statistic. If we were to ever find 20 students that all speak the same language in the district, we are mandated to find a teacher that speaks in that language. So I've added Polish teachers, I've added Japanese teachers,
At other
I've
districts?
added Indian teachers, yes, because there's all kinds of national laws. The other good news, though, is with the number of students, we believe we're gonna be able to qualify for some other second language grants that we have not been able to apply for before.
State or federal?
Federal. But I'm not really sure how that'll play out, since that's new to the district at this point.
Do we have particular languages where there's a critical mass? I mean, is there
Not
two that stand
really.
out, or three, or it's just a?
It's pretty divided here.
Okay.
It really is. And there's an educational philosophy that the more you upload services in kindergarten and first grade and get them reading, the less services the district will have to provide for those kids as they get older.
Another question I had, you said that you were eliminating the current half-day kindergarten teacher that you're gonna promote to full-time. You're gonna take away her half-day of RTI work. How, and your reasoning is that much of that work will be, having the ELL teacher will help those kids. What about the kids who need RTI who are not ELL?
The other thing that Joanne Trahanis and I have talked a little bit about is being able to use either some of our reading specialists. We have a couple reading specialists at the elementary school. We can use some of our special ed teachers when they pull groups So we have lots of abilities to do that. And if I feel strongly that with the staff that we have, we can meet those needs of our kindergarten students.
And then my last question had to do with so there's a waiting list of 5 students for full-time. And right now, given the numbers you have right now, you're not proposing an additional full-time. Would that change if we got 9 kids over the summer and a fair amount of them wanted to be full day?
I think that would depend. I would bring that to you. I would share that over the summer, there may be other full-time people that decide they're gonna opt for halftime.
It could go both ways, yeah.
We've had 2 people that were opted for halftime that now want to go to full-time. So
We're not mandating to offer full-time.
we're not mandated now to offer full-time.
Eventually, this.
So that's an extra service.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
So I don't see those numbers going up high enough to recommend a full-time. And, I'm sorry to share that with the parents that are on the waiting list, but at this particular point, we don't have the space, or really the class sizes would be so low, it would be somewhat impractical to do that.
I know we've talked in the past about the possibility of mixing classes so that you have half-day students and full-day students mixed together. By law, you've got to provide in the morning, everybody has to get the same thing anyway, so I'm curious to know if there's an educational reason not to do that, because doing so seems to me like it would give you a chance to move those kids, those families that want the full day to do it.
Well, right now, we don't even have the numbers. The numbers would be too low to run 4 classes. Because you'd have,
Yeah, but you're assuming that you're going to get another 9 students over the summer or something like that.
but we don't know if those will be full-time or half-time.
Right. So I'm just asking, are you considering at all mixing them together, and is there an educational reason not to?
I will share with you that my very first meeting to the district in my transition was a meeting Dr. Martindale brought me to with the kindergarten staff and parents. And it was unanimous from the staff and the parents that that was not desired. I think educationally, it would be hard. The one thing that struck me from that meeting was having kids that are there in the morning and then they leave their classmates while their classmates are there in the afternoon. So I would say I don't see that happening unless I really saw some strong research that that was a good idea.
Difficult to manage from a classroom standpoint, because
Well, every year, though, there's this rub of trying to balance out the number of kids in full day and the number of kids in half day, and how many people prefer this one or prefer that one, and
That is very true.
we're going to end up with a few people probably not being very happy in any scenario.
public school.
So,
Right now, I don't see the numbers for it, and we'll continue to monitor that. Our registrar, Jean, actually provides me the numbers weekly and keeps me up to date with the second language students, because they need to be tested before we put them in also.
So, picking up on that, in '08 and '09, we did have those 4 full-day sections, and in fact, in '08, we had 84 total, and we already have 80, and we're predicting somewhere around 5 to 9 or 10 more. It looks like we're almost at critical mass for another full day, to me.
I would prefer to wait until August to make that decision.
Okay, but you feel like we have that flexibility to
We
make
can,
that decision in
absolutely,
August?
because
Okay.
right now, we have a music room that can be turned to music on a cart and made into a kindergarten classroom.
We somehow did it before, right?
Right.
And we managed in '08 and '09.
But here's what I would share with you. When we talked about our original class sizes, and offhand, Susan, I think you were there
I
when we
was,
met.
yeah.
So-
These 19 was at the high end.
19 was the highest.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
But if you look on that, 13 is the half-day. That's very low in the 08, 09.
Oh, yeah, yeah, I know.
got 23 and half.
Right. So, which now we would divide that into 2.
So that's what I'm
So-
saying.
I just,
I want to keep
And certainly
our
if
mind
that's
open on
something-
this issue.
My mind, we have a classroom saved for it. But I don't know if I'm ready looking at the numbers to do that without knowing, at least by, our next meeting is July 23rd, we could relook at numbers then for a full day.
And you're comfortable with your ability to react to perhaps an increase with staff hiring to find people to fill those positions that late in the year?
Kindergarten teacher I could find, an ELL teacher would be a little bit more difficult. We have a potential classroom, and we actually have the curriculum. Because the curriculum from this fourth teacher was saved, and we've already located that in case we need it.
I mean, we're collapsing two conversations into one here. It seems to me the ELL is that seems pretty straightforward, you know, to me anyway, that we need to do what you're recommending. And the kindergarten thing, I think, bears further thought and discussion, especially depending how many kids you sign up over the summer.
I agree.
Well, let's take a look at the numbers on July 23rd at our next meeting, because that would give us a full month if we decided at that time to add another section.
Keep us posted if you think you can react to it quickly enough, then, yeah.
We have everything kind of done behind the scenes, just in case. I'm not quite ready for the numbers for that yet. So we'll wait and see how it plays out.
Yeah, I just would like to comment that when we talked about this, I don't think 19 was what we were aiming for. That was more of kind of like an outer limit.
That was max.
That was an outer limit.
Right,
Yeah,
right, it looks,
not a happy place.
yeah.
Well, is that something would you like me to consider dividing up now, or can we wait till July 23rd?
Let's wait.
I'm okay with waiting, I just, I think we can't go, I think we ought to be aiming for below 19,
I would share with you that in a kindergarten class here, that was the max, and we're at our max.
yeah.
But yet, when you look at the numbers for that, divided by 4, it's still very small.
Yeah,
When you add the other students,
yeah, I mean,
And we'll
look at
look to see
08,
what-
09, 010, if we had taken those 25, so there's 90 kids, right? If we'd taken those 25 and divided them through the full days, it would be 17 or 18,
We
but
eliminate some speculation if we can wait another 6 weeks.
I agree, that's fine.
that was kind of my plan.
I just wanted you to know that 19 doesn't look great to me.
Well,
That's fine.
we are set.
I'm assuming, I think that it'd be problematic if you have a lot of non-English speaker in the classroom. But, in a fairly homogeneous school district, I mean, 19 is not, I mean, I think there's some out of the line items for 19. I mean, I can tell you from my experience teaching is that, so I have some class where I have 19 guys, and it's like pulling teeth.
You're right.
I have another section, same class, where there's 25, and it goes like a
Right,
breeze.
yeah, that's
So-
right.
So I'm not too hung up on the number, I think it's the mix. I think that if you can mix the students better, so you don't have too many problem children, or, you know what I'm trying to say.
Yes, right, I agree.
I think I would feel more comfortable making a recommendation for another section in July.
That's
Because
fine.
then the numbers are more solid.
Yep.
That's fine.
But in the meantime, is everybody comfortable with me bringing the ELL vote up for next month?
Yes.
Or next
Yep.
week?
Okay, do we have any other questions on item 5, the ELL and the kindergarten issue? Our last item, number 6, Neil. We offer the opportunity at the end of every meeting for additional public comment. If anybody would like to address the board, please do so now.
Motion to adjourn.
Otherwise, you interested? We were going to formally have an opportunity to say something.
Turn his hearing aid down.
So can I have any other issues anybody needs to raise?
No.
May I please have a motion to adjourn at 10 PM?
So moved?
So Leanne first and John second.
All in favor?
All in
Aye.
favor? Yes. The ayes have it.
Thank you, everyone.
I was fine.